The swamps whisper. The Lowcountry keeps its secrets. And from Charleston's haunted streets to Greenville's cold case files, South Carolina is a state where the past refuses to stay buried. Tonight, we're descending into 33 mysteries, murders without answers, disappearances without traces, legends without logic. No neat resolutions, no comforting conclusions, just questions that gnaw at history and silence that feels heavier with every passing year. These are the stories South Carolina doesn't explain, because maybe it can't. Do you want me to shape this intro in a voiceover-ready script style? Pauses, cinematic cues, or keep it as a tight narration block? Before we dive in, take a second to hit subscribe. It keeps these mysteries alive and brings you more stories the history books don't bother to solve. And since you're here with us in the dark, I want to know, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious who else is awake at this hour, chasing shadows across South Carolina. Sumter County does. They were found lying side by side on a quiet dirt road in Sumter County, South Carolina, one warm August morning in 1976. A young man and woman, both brutally murdered, both anonymous, both looking as if they had simply fallen out of the sky. The sheriff's deputies, the photographers, the coroner, they all gathered around the bodies, baffled by the odd details. The man wore a t-shirt from a racetrack in Nevada, the woman a simple blouse. They had no wallets, no IDs, no obvious ties to the place where their lives ended. Their faces, striking, even in death, became their only passport to recognition. And for decades, those faces became ghosts, haunting the bulletin boards of police stations and the nightmares of small-town detectives. They were dubbed the Sumter County Does, a name that reduces flesh and bone into cold syllables. A placeholder for what nobody could pin down: who they were, where they came from, and why anyone would want them dead. A man and a woman, clearly traveling together, yet no one claimed them. Not a single missing persons report seemed to fit. For years, the case lived in that liminal space between tragedy and riddle, a local curiosity that occasionally clawed its way back into the national spotlight. Theories bloomed like kudzu. Were they hitchhikers picked up by the wrong driver? Were they criminals themselves, silenced by partners in crime? Perhaps they were runaways from wealthy families, erased in a remote corner of the Carolinas to keep some scandal secret. The Nevada t-shirt especially stirred speculation. Did they drift cross-country, or was it just another misleading detail, planted like a joke by fate? The strangeness only deepened with time. Investigators tried everything. Photographs circulated, dental records checked, sketches drawn and redrawn. Their faces were reconstructed in clay, then digitized decades later into eerily lifelike renderings. The story made its way into newspaper features and true crime programs, usually framed as one of those haunting they-could-be-anyone tales. People swore they recognized them: neighbors, long-lost cousins, an old boyfriend, but the leads always fizzled. The unsettling part wasn't just that they were murdered, it was that their very identities dissolved like mist. Imagine someone you loved vanishing, not only killed, but scrubbed from memory so thoroughly that their bodies could lie in a morgue, tagged as John and Jane Doe, while you sit across the country thinking they simply never called home. That's the cruelty of the case, the way it weaponizes anonymity itself. Decades later, in the early 2002 and 2010, forensic science marched forward. DNA testing became a new oracle. Investigators tried exhumations, scraping bone and tooth for the secrets hidden in genetic code. And finally, after over 40 years, the names emerged. The woman was Pamela Buckley from Colorado. The man, James Freund, from Pennsylvania. Their lives, once vapor, snapped back into focus. A missing person poster here, a newspaper clipping there, old photographs now infused with tragic weight. They were not nameless wanderers. They were somebody's children. But here's the kicker. Solving their names didn't solve their deaths. Their identities were uncovered, yes, but the why remains frozen in time. No killer, no motive, no neat conclusion. Just two young lives cut short on a back road in South Carolina, their final chapter still locked. It's almost cruel, the way truth arrived in pieces who they were, but not why. Like receiving the corner pieces of a puzzle and being told the rest is lost forever. And so the mystery metastasizes. If DNA could resurrect their names, why couldn't it catch the killer? If they were from such different states, why were they together? Did they know their murderer? Or were they unlucky pawns in some senseless act of violence? Investigators have their theories, but every road they walk seems to curl back on itself. The Sumter County does remain suspended in that strange purgatory, simultaneously identified and unknown, solved and unsolved, both a success story of forensic persistence and a failure of justice. The contradictions stack up until they become the story itself. South Carolina has many mysteries, but few that taunt us with this much irony. And if the road they died on is quiet now, you'd never know it once hosted such a riddle. It's the kind of place you drive past without a second thought, not realizing history is whispering there. Yet that's the thing about mysteries in South Carolina. They don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they sit disguised in the ordinary, until the ordinary becomes unbearable. Because if two people can be found murdered, lying side by side in a sleepy county, and the answers never surface, what else might be lurking in plain sight? Take, for example, the story of a small town bank where ordinary people went about their lives, until one ordinary morning, the walls soaked up a silence that still hasn't been explained. Blue Ridge Savings Bank, triple homicide. On a September morning in 2003, the quiet hum of Greer, South Carolina, was broken not by alarms or shouting, but by something worse: silence. Inside the Blue Ridge Savings Bank, 3 people lay dead. A teller, Sylvia Holtzclaw, who had been working her shift as she always did, and 2 customers, Ebb and Maggie Barnes, a husband and wife in their 70s, who had simply stopped in to handle routine business. Their lives intersected in that little bank in what should have been an utterly forgettable Tuesday morning, and then ended there in a way that even now defies explanation. The scene was neat, almost disturbingly so. This wasn't the chaos of a bungled robbery. Nothing about it matched the cinematic violence people expect from such stories. The cash drawers were still full, the vault untouched. If the motive was money, the killer seemed to have lost interest midway through. If the motive was personal, investigators could never trace a line between the victims and any potential enemy. It was as though someone had stepped inside, removed 3 lives from the equation, and vanished into thin air. The town reeled. This wasn't New York or Los Angeles, it was Greer, a place where people still waved to each other from front porches, where the biggest news on most days was a high school football score or a new diner opening. A triple homicide in a bank shattered not just 3 lives, but the illusion of small-town safety. People locked their doors a little earlier, eyed strangers a little harder, and whispered about the possibility that the killer might still be walking among them. Investigators threw everything they had at the case. The FBI came in. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Roadblocks sprouted up like weeds. Yet the killer, or killers, remained invisible. Security cameras, the supposed eye that never blinks, gave no salvation. The footage was either absent, corrupted, or never installed at all, depending on which version of the story you believe. Imagine how strange that is. A bank without a clear security trail, a crime scene where the very technology designed to preserve the truth produced only static. Rumors bloomed in the vacuum. Some said it was a professional hit, carefully executed to send a message. But who in Greer needed that kind of message? Others whispered it was random, a drifter passing through, a lunatic who picked the wrong building at the wrong time. The randomness was perhaps more terrifying than the idea of a professional. Because randomness means it could happen to anyone, anywhere. Then came the theories tying the case to a wider web. A suspect in a string of robberies out west, a name that surfaced and then dissolved, DNA tests that promised clarity but only offered more shadows. For a brief, flickering moment, hope stirred. Perhaps the killer had finally been found, but the evidence never congealed into certainty. Without that, it was just another ghost in the investigative file cabinet. Years passed, and with them, the crime calcified into a local legend. The Blue Ridge Bank closed, the building changed hands, the world moved on. But not the families of the victims. For them, every holiday was a reminder of absence, every news story a chance that maybe, just maybe, the truth had finally been wrestled out of hiding. And yet, the headlines never brought resolution. Here's the cruelest paradox. If the crime had been messier, if money had been taken, if some obvious trail had been left, maybe investigators could have worked backward to a culprit. Instead, the neatness of the scene has become its own enigma. It's the silence that unsettles, the absence of motive, the lack of struggle, the clean lines of something that looks almost staged. The case stands as a monument to the limits of logic. We are conditioned to think crimes make sense, that motives can be deduced, that puzzle pieces eventually fit. But what if the world refuses to cooperate? What if some puzzles are designed to remain unsolvable? Not because of missing pieces, but because the image on the box was a lie all along. The Blue Ridge Savings Bank murders leave behind an uncomfortable question. Is it worse to know the name of the killer and not understand why they did it, or to never know the killer at all? In Greer, they live with the latter, and the bank, once a symbol of routine commerce, has become a tombstone of unanswered questions. And it's not the only case in South Carolina where silence fills the gaps left by violence. Just ask anyone who's followed the story of a young man named Stephen Smith, whose body was found on a lonely road in Hampton County, and whose death has attracted whispers, speculation, and contradictions that grow stranger with each passing year. Strange, isn't it? 2 lives ended on a lonely Carolina road, and still no one can explain how or why. And we're only just beginning. Before we press further down this trail of unanswered questions, take a moment to subscribe. That way you won't miss the rest of the journey. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it as these mysteries unfold for you? Stephen Smith. Hampton County, South Carolina, is the kind of place where a car pulled off on the shoulder is enough to spark a conversation. Everyone notices. Everyone speculates. It's a community that prides itself on knowing who belongs to which family, who drives which pickup, and who's headed where on a given night. That's why, when Stephen Smith was found dead on a rural road in 2015, the questions started immediately, and they haven't stopped. Stephen was 19, a nursing student, a kid with plans that stretched beyond the horizons of Hampton County. On the surface, his death was chalked up quickly, labeled as a hit and run. The explanation seemed simple enough. A young man walking alone down a dark country road at night, a passing vehicle that never stopped. Tragic, but tragically common. Case closed. Except it wasn't. From the very beginning, the details didn't add up. His injuries didn't quite align with what one expects from being struck by a car. His shoes were still on, neatly, which often isn't the case in high-impact collisions. There was no debris on the road, no shattered glass, no telltale paint transfer. And there was something even stranger. Stephen's car was found 3 miles away, out of gas, but the keys were still in the ignition. If he had been walking for help, why would he be found in the middle of the road rather than off to the side, where most people instinctively move when cars approach? The contradictions stacked up like poorly shuffled playing cards. Local investigators muttered their doubts, but the official narrative rolled forward anyway. Hit and run was the tidy label, and tidy labels keep communities calm. But behind the scenes, other whispers were circulating. Whispers of who Stephen knew, who he may have been seen with, and why some names seemed untouchable. This is where the story becomes less about forensics and more about sociology. Hampton County isn't just a dot on the map, it's a place where certain families carry more weight than the courthouse itself. And when Stephen's death is mentioned, The same names surface over and over again in hushed tones. Those names have been linked, fairly or not, to wealth, power, and influence. It's the kind of connection that turns an unexplained death into a long-running legend. As investigators revisited the case years later, fueled by renewed scrutiny into Hampton County's most prominent family, the Murdaughs, Stephen's story found new life. Reporters arrived. True crime podcasts dissected every known detail, from the positioning of his body to the inconsistencies in interviews. The case that had once been pushed into the background was suddenly center stage, not because of new evidence, but because the atmosphere around it had changed. People who once whispered in kitchens now spoke into microphones. And yet, for all the media frenzy, the core mystery remains unsolved. No car has been found. No driver has confessed. No clear forensic trail points in any direction. The contradictions are the story. Was Stephen walking that road because he trusted someone to come pick him up? Did he encounter the wrong people at the wrong time? Or was it truly the rarest of accidents, a hit and run so clean it left behind nothing but unanswered questions? The sadness lingers in the ordinariness of Stephen's last night. He had been studying, talking with friends, doing all the small things that should have added up to nothing more than another ordinary evening. Instead, the road where he was found has become an unofficial landmark, a place locals pass with a glance out the window, each person forming their own silent theory. If there's anything universal about mysteries like Stephen's, it's how they transform. At first, it's a tragedy. Then it becomes gossip. Then, as years pass, it crystallizes into folklore, half-truth, half-speculation, endlessly retold. Everyone has an opinion, and no one has certainty. That's the curse of Hampton County's riddle. The line between evidence and rumor is as crooked as the backroads themselves. Even the reinvestigation, as of now, hasn't settled the matter. Promises of new leads and fresh eyes rise and fall like the tide, but definitive answers remain just beyond reach. Which leaves the haunting possibility that maybe the truth will never be publicly known, or worse, that it's known privately by those who simply have no incentive to share it. The Stephen Smith case is one of those moments where the ordinary collides with the extraordinary. A young man out of gas, a road in the dark, a mystery that refuses to sit quietly. And as much as people want to see it solved, there's an even darker truth hiding underneath. Some mysteries serve as mirrors, reflecting not only what happened to one person, but what happens in communities where influence is thicker than justice. And that reflection becomes even sharper when you look at another South Carolina mystery from the very same year, a horror that didn't happen on a lonely road, but inside the safety of a family home, where 4 lives were taken in one night and no answers have ever stuck. The Pendleton quadruple homicide. Pendleton, quadruple homicide. Pendleton, South Carolina. The name itself sounds pastoral, almost sleepy, conjuring images of small-town charm and quiet porches where the world slows down. But in 2015, that illusion cracked. 1 family, 4 lives, gone in a single night, and the town has never fully recovered. The victims were the Burton family, 3 generations living under one roof. On the surface, it was a portrait of small-town resilience, grandparents providing stability, parents juggling the demands of modern life, children caught somewhere between innocence and responsibility. They weren't the sort of family people whispered about. No scandals, no feuds, no trail of enemies, just a home in Pendleton. And then, suddenly, that home became the site of one of South Carolina's darkest mysteries. Investigators walked into a house that should have been mundane, but instead was a study in contradictions. 4 people, all dead, yet nothing stolen, no clear forced entry, no quick explanation. Whoever had entered that home left more questions than evidence. Forensic teams combed through the rooms, cataloging every fingerprint, every hair strand, every scuff on the floorboards. But the answers never aligned into a neat picture. The horror of it was magnified by the math. 4 lives lost at once. A triple homicide is shocking enough, but 4 in a single family unit? It creates an emotional crater in a community. The funerals were packed, not just with grieving relatives, but with neighbors, co-workers, teachers, even strangers who felt compelled to attend simply because the tragedy was too heavy to ignore. Pendleton wasn't just grieving, it was rattled to its bones. As weeks turned into months, the questions piled up. What was the motive? If it was robbery, why leave behind valuables? If it was personal, why silence the entire household? The brutality suggested something emotional, yet the evidence trail suggested someone disturbingly calculated. It's the kind of contradiction that paralyzes investigations. Every path forward collapses under the weight of its own inconsistencies. Local law enforcement worked closely with state agencies, and at times the FBI stepped in, but even with the full machinery of modern investigation, the case stalled. The crime scene refused to yield clarity. Leads evaporated, rumors multiplied. Some locals whispered about shadowy ties, others about grudges that had never made it into public view. Theories floated. Maybe the family knew too much. Maybe they saw something they shouldn't have. Maybe it was a message from someone who didn't want to be identified. But the absence of evidence made all of it speculative. And then there's the silence, an unusual silence. In many unsolved homicides, at least one person eventually talks. A rumor slips out at a bar, a confession is half mumbled in a prison cell, a cousin decides to clear their conscience after too many sleepless nights. But in Pendleton's quadruple homicide, nothing has ever surfaced, not even a whisper credible enough to follow. That silence is eerie, almost unnatural, as though the crime was designed not just to end lives, but to erase the story itself. Time has a way of rewriting tragedies. For some, the Pendleton murders became just another news item filed away under unsolved. But for the families of the victims, the wound is permanent. Holidays are marked by absence, birthdays by empty chairs, milestones by what should have been. For the town, the house itself became an unintentional monument. People drive past it slower. They avoid mentioning it directly, but it hangs in the air like humidity in August, unseen but heavy, pressing down. What unsettles people most is the ordinariness. This wasn't a notorious figure with enemies. This wasn't a feud brewing in public. This was a family. And if a family in Pendleton could vanish in such a way, then the fragile sense of safety in small-town South Carolina feels more like an illusion than a fact. It raises a quiet but terrifying question. How many other locked doors are only locked against ordinary dangers, not the unthinkable ones? Investigators keep the file open, officially calling it unresolved, unofficially admitting they're waiting for either a technological breakthrough or human conscience to crack the silence. Advances in DNA testing, genealogical tracing, digital surveillance, all the new tools of modern forensics sit like distant promises. Maybe one day, maybe never. The Pendleton case lingers like a ghost story without a ghost, a hole in the narrative of a community that prefers tidy endings, but mysteries rarely grant those. Instead, they leave you staring into the abyss of why and realizing you may never get an answer. And Pendleton isn't alone. Across South Carolina, the soil seems almost saturated with stories like this, lives cut short, questions left unanswered, communities forced into uneasy silence. In some cases, there are multiple names, a string of victims scattered across decades, their stories overlapping into a grim catalog of unfinished tales. The murders of Corrine Sanders, Kevin Holder, Christopher Rogers, Willie Ryans, and so many others, each one another question mark in the state's long ledger of the unexplained. Murders of Corrine Sanders, Kevin Holder, Christopher Rogers, Willie Ryans, etc. South Carolina's open case files are crowded with names that never make the front page anymore, if they ever did at all. These are not the mysteries that bring in national film crews or get dissected in primetime specials. They are quieter, harder, almost mundane in their persistence. They don't orbit around a single high-profile family or a neatly packaged conspiracy theory. Instead, they are scattered across counties and decades, haunting the state like unclaimed debts. Among these names are Corinne Sanders, Kevin Holder, Christopher Rogers, Willie Ryans, and many others whose stories stretch back across northern and central South Carolina. Each was killed. Each case remains unsolved, and each one is a question the community has learned to live beside without ever answering. Take Corinne Sanders. Her case is remembered only in fragments, her name on a list of unsolved homicides, her memory carried by a dwindling circle of family and friends. The record shows she died violently, but beyond that, the facts dissolve. Who had reason to harm her? Why was justice never found? The unanswered questions are as much a legacy as her life itself. Then there's Kevin Holder, another name on the roster of the unresolved. Holder's case is particularly unsettling because it underscores the randomness of violence in the state. He was not part of a headline-grabbing scandal or a notorious feud. He was simply living his life until he wasn't TID, and while detectives filed their paperwork and canvassed neighborhoods, the trail went cold. The killer, if there even was one clear suspect, remains free, their secret intact. Christopher Rogers and Willie Ryans are names that almost never leave local conversations. Their deaths never ballooned into sensational narratives. No Hollywood dramatization, no podcasts with moody background music. But in their families' kitchens, the grief remains a constant hum. Every year, anniversaries roll by, and the same question, why hasn't this been solved, is asked with fewer and fewer expectations of an answer. The uncomfortable truth is that these cases illustrate a pattern, not an exception. South Carolina, like much of the country, has an unglamorous backlog of unsolved murders. Some are the product of scarce resources, small police departments juggling too many cases, too little money, and limited access to advanced forensic tools. Others collapse under the weight of silence, witnesses unwilling to come forward, either out of fear, loyalty, or distrust in the system. And some, perhaps most hauntingly, are unsolved because the evidence was never there to begin with. A moment of violence unfolds, the killer disappears, and what's left is nothing but aftermath. What ties these scattered cases together is the way they shape communities. In places like Sumter, Spartanburg, and Columbia, the names of unsolved victims hover in conversations like unfinished sentences. People remember where they were when the news first broke, who first spread the rumor, who was arrested and later released, who was suspected but never charged. Over time, the details blur, but the suspicion lingers. Entire neighborhoods live under the shadow of the unspoken possibility that someone among them knows exactly what happened. The passage of time only complicates the picture. As years stretch into decades, the victims' families shrink. Parents pass away without answers. Siblings grow old, carrying the weight of silence. New generations inherit the mystery like a family heirloom they never asked for. And with every passing year, the cases become harder to solve, not because the truth has changed, but because the witnesses fade, the evidence degrades, and the urgency drains away. What makes this collection of cases particularly unsettling is the lack of narrative closure. Most mysteries offer at least a theory, a working idea of who, or how, or why. Here, the theories are thin and unsatisfying. Maybe the killer was a stranger. Maybe it was someone known. Maybe it was an act of opportunity. Or maybe it was personal. Every theory ends in the same place: uncertainty. And yet, even in their anonymity, these victims form a kind of collective story. They remind us that mysteries don't always come wrapped in Gothic trappings or tied to powerful dynasties. Sometimes the most haunting mystery is the one with no glamour at all, no wider implications beyond the simple injustice of lives ended and silence preserved. But silence doesn't mean absence. These cases are still officially open. Files sit in dusty cabinets, waiting for technology to catch up, for DNA to speak, for someone's conscience to crack. All it would take is one breakthrough, One sliver of evidence. One person deciding they've carried the secret long enough. And if that breakthrough seems unlikely, consider this. Just because we don't see progress doesn't mean it isn't happening quietly. In some offices, detectives still revisit these files, still make the occasional call, still hope lightning might strike. Because if even one of these names were given justice, it would prove that the unsolvable isn't truly unsolvable, it's just waiting. But until then, the names remain on the list, a somber roll call of unfinished business, and they are not alone. Just a year before one of these cases stalled in silence, another life, Emery Lorenzo Williams, was cut short under circumstances equally unresolved, adding yet another name to South Carolina's long roster of mysteries. Emery Lorenzo Williams. In 2014, in the northern reaches of South Carolina, another name joined the state's long list of unresolved mysteries. Emery Lorenzo Williams. His case didn't become a household phrase, and it never drew the kind of national spotlight that swarms around the sensational. But for those who knew him, and for the investigators still haunted by the open file, the absence of resolution feels just as heavy as any of the state's more notorious enigmas. Williams's story is one of those that seems, at first glance, tragically straightforward. A man killed, a life cut short, yet the closer you look, the stranger it becomes. No clear motive emerged, no suspect was ever convicted, no tidy conclusion allowed his family to say, "At least we know what happened." Instead, his death has lived in that purgatory of unanswered questions, one of the worst places a family can be left. By all accounts, Williams wasn't the type of person you'd expect to become the centerpiece of a mystery. He wasn't entangled in a high-profile scandal or involved in some shadowy feud. He was living in a community where people recognized faces, if not names, and where the rhythms of life moved at the steady pace of the Carolinas. To wake up one day and discover that his name would forever be stamped with the word unsolved seemed incomprehensible to those around him. The investigation unfolded with all the predictable steps: interviews, evidence collection, neighborhood canvassing. Detectives looked for patterns, for context, for that small clue that might widen into a breakthrough, and yet each lead collapsed almost as soon as it appeared. Witnesses contradicted one another, timelines blurred, and physical evidence seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. Like so many other South Carolina mysteries, Williams' death resisted being forced into a narrative that made sense. That resistance is what makes his story so difficult for outsiders to grasp. In most tragedies, there is at least some comfort in knowing why. Why this person, why that day, why those circumstances. But in Emery's case, the why is a black hole. Every possible motive feels speculative. Was he targeted? Was it a matter of wrong place, wrong time? Was it random? Each theory has been floated, and each one has fallen apart, leaving only silence in its place. For his family, the lack of answers is a torment that outlives the crime itself. Closure is not just a word, but a process of putting grief into a shape that can be carried. Without answers, grief remains shapeless, heavy, impossible to hold without being cut by its sharp edges. Year after year, they've watched anniversaries pass, birthdays slip by, news cycles churn with fresh headlines, while his case remains frozen in 2014, unresolved. The broader community has felt the ripple effects too. Northern South Carolina has its share of mysteries, but each new unsolved case adds to the climate of unease. People lock their doors earlier, cast longer glances at strangers, and wonder aloud whether justice is something they can still believe in. That's the power of unsolved cases. They don't just affect the families of the victims. They unsettle entire neighborhoods, feeding the sense that danger can slip in and out of town without consequence. And then there's the institutional side of it. Police and investigators live with these cases like splinters under the skin. They know the names, they remember the faces, they replay the interviews. Some of them move on to other assignments, others retire, but the case files remain. Emery's name is still there, in black ink, surrounded by questions that no one has yet been able to erase. And every so often, when resources allow, detectives circle back, flip through the pages, and ask themselves again, what did we miss? What's striking is how these smaller, quieter cases often carry the same weight as the famous ones, but without the attention. They're not dissected in glossy magazines or adapted into docuseries. They don't fuel book deals or spin out into global conversations. They simply sit, unresolved, while the families who love these people carry the burden almost entirely alone. Emery's story is a reminder that mysteries don't need headlines to be devastating, they only need silence. And silence is what South Carolina has in abundance. Still, history has shown that silence doesn't always last forever. Forensic technology advances year by year, and what once seemed impossible has a way of becoming possible. Cold cases across the country have been cracked open decades later by a single touch of DNA, a drop of blood, a sliver of evidence once deemed irrelevant. For Emery, and for so many others, that possibility is the thin thread of hope that keeps families from giving up entirely. But hope has a cruel way of standing shoulder to shoulder with despair. Every time a new lead fails, every time another year passes without answers, the scale tips. And so Emery's name remains a question mark, a reminder that even in a world of satellites, smartphones, and DNA databases, people can still vanish from the record of accountability. And he is not alone. Just 12 years earlier, two young men, Zachary Cunard and Michael Mickey McGraw, were killed in northern South Carolina, their double homicide frozen in time with no resolution. Another riddle that continues to whisper in the background of the state's unsolved history. Zachary Cunard and Michael Mickey McGraw. In 2002, in the northern part of South Carolina, two young men, Zachary Cunard and Michael Mickey McGraw, were found dead in circumstances that continue to baffle investigators and unsettle their communities. Their names are not widely known outside the circles of their families, their friends, and the patchwork of law enforcement officers who still carry the weight of the case file. Yet within the state, their story has persisted like an echo that refuses to fade, another puzzle piece in South Carolina's long catalog of mysteries. Zachary and Mickey were not celebrities or public figures. They were, in many ways, ordinary young men, navigating lives filled with the kind of choices and dreams that mark early adulthood. The promise of careers, friendships, maybe families of their own someday. Yet that promise was cut short. What makes their case resonate all these years later is not only the tragedy of lives ended too soon, but the almost clinical way the details dissolve into uncertainty. On paper, the case seems deceptively solvable. Two victims, a defined place, a moment in time. Usually, those parameters give investigators something to work with. Yet in this instance, the framework collapses almost immediately. The evidence collected never formed a coherent narrative. The crime scene yielded fewer answers than anyone expected. And the circle of people connected to Zachary and Mickey didn't point clearly toward any motive that could explain the double homicide. For the families, that lack of clarity has been its own form of punishment. Losing a loved one is devastating enough. Losing two in a way that suggests violence, but offers no clear story that's unbearable. The Cunard and McGraw families have carried that burden for over 2 decades now, enduring the strange limbo that only unsolved cases produce. It is a grief that never resolves, a question that never finds punctuation. The double nature of the crime only amplifies the questions. With a single victim, there is always the possibility of a personal grudge, a one-on-one conflict that spiraled out of control. But two victims together introduces new layers. Were Zachary and Mickey both targeted intentionally, or did one become collateral damage in an attempt to silence the other? Were they in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in a chance encounter that ended in tragedy? Or was the act deliberate, cold, calculated, a double elimination that was meant to erase something bigger than either of them? Investigators pursued every thread they could find. Interviews were conducted, timelines reconstructed, possibilities weighed. Some leads pointed one way, some another, and none ever converged into certainty. The lack of arrests over the years is not necessarily evidence of negligence. It is, instead, a reflection of how stubbornly resistant this case has been to resolution. The mystery seems to mock the very systems designed to solve it. In the years since, technology has evolved. DNA analysis has become sharper, databases larger, investigative methods more sophisticated. Cold case units across the country have cracked mysteries once deemed impenetrable. And yet, for Zachary and Mickey, no such breakthrough has come. Their case file remains open but static, waiting for the day when new tools or new testimony might shift the balance. It is easy, in retelling a story like this, to focus solely on the puzzle. But there are human dimensions too often overlooked. Zachary and Mickey were not just names in a file. They were people. They laughed, they argued, they dreamed. They belong to families who still carry their absence like a weight on the chest. Their loved ones don't just want to know who did this, they want to know why. The why is the piece that allows mourning to settle into memory instead of circling endlessly in the vacuum of confusion. Communities too carry scars. Northern South Carolina is not immune to crime, but when a double homicide goes unsolved for decades, it creates an atmosphere of lingering suspicion. People wonder, did someone get away with it? Could they be living among us, ordinary, unremarkable, invisible? That kind of thought doesn't go away easily. It alters the way people view one another, the way trust is built or withheld in small towns. The Cunard and McGraw case sits in the uncomfortable space between tragedy and folklore. It is not famous enough to become a cultural touchstone, but it is unforgettable for those who lived through the shock of it. For them, every mention is a reminder that time doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just deepens the mystery. And in South Carolina, there is never just one case like this. The list continues, each name its own unsolved riddle. Just a few decades before Zachary and Mickey, another name was added to the state's roster of unresolved tragedies, Norma Lanyon Jackson, whose 1,978 murder still resists explanation. Another shadow in a long line of shadows. Norma Lanyon Jackson. The year was 1978, and South Carolina was in the midst of change. Factories were closing, new industries were moving in, and small towns were wrestling with the kind of cultural shifts that tend to ripple quietly at first and then echo for decades. Against that backdrop, a woman named Norma Lanyon Jackson became the center of a story that has never found its ending. Her murder was not just another crime statistic. It was an event that froze a community in time, another entry in the long and growing book of unsolved mysteries scattered across the state. What makes Norma's case so haunting is not just the violence itself, but the way her story has dissolved into uncertainty. 40+ years later, the details have blurred into fragments. Reports are piecemeal, theories conflict, and yet her name remains, carried forward on lists of unresolved cases like an ember that refuses to go out. For those who knew her, the ember burns brighter. But even for strangers, there's something about her case that unsettles, the way it underscores how fragile safety really is, and how quickly the narrative of a life can be rewritten by forces outside one's control. Norma was, by all accounts, a woman rooted in her community. She had connections, routines, a life that looked ordinary enough from the outside. She wasn't a drifter or an unknown face passing through town. That's what makes the mystery sharper. When a stranger dies in a strange place, anonymity provides an easy excuse for silence. But when a member of the community is lost and no culprit emerges, it creates an entirely different kind of unease. The silence becomes personal. Investigators at the time did what they could with the tools available. They interviewed neighbors. They retraced her last known steps. They looked at the people closest to her, as investigators always do. They sought motives in financial records, in relationships, in daily patterns, and yet no theory ever fully held. Leads fizzled, suspicions didn't turn into evidence. And slowly, as days turned into weeks and weeks into years, the case hardened into that most frustrating of categories: unsolved. For the families of victims, unsolved is not just a legal term. It is an open wound. Norma's family carried that wound into the decades that followed. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering carried with it the reminder of her absence and the absence of justice. When anniversaries of her death came around, the local paper might run a small blurb. The police might issue a quiet reminder that the case was still technically active, but nothing ever came of it. Time passed, and with it, the hope of resolution dimmed, though it never completely went out. The case reflects something larger about South Carolina's history of cold cases. In the 1972nd, forensic science was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. DNA was not yet a tool. Fingerprints were useful, but often inconclusive. Witness testimony carried weight, but it was and still is fallible. What Norma's case lacked in technological support was supposed to be made up for by community vigilance. But as often happens in small towns, rumors replaced facts, speculation replaced evidence, and the official record began to look less like a roadmap to justice and more like a palimpsest of unanswered questions. There are whispers about what might have happened to her. Some suggest personal motives, a conflict behind closed doors that spiraled into something irreversible. Others argue it was random, an act of violence from someone outside the community who vanished as quickly as they appeared. Still others float the possibility of secrets tied to money, property, or personal history that never made it into the public record. Each theory offers a glimpse of possibility, but none of them fit tightly enough to close the circle. What is left, then, is the enduring weight of ambiguity. Norma's story reminds us that mystery is not always cinematic. It is not always a stranger in the shadows or a dramatic twist waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes it is far quieter. Sometimes it is the absence of explanation, the stubborn refusal of facts to align into meaning. That kind of mystery gnaws at the edges of memory because it leaves too much space for the imagination to fill. For Pendleton, for Greer, for Hampton County, towns touched by other mysteries, Norma's case is a reminder that these stories are not isolated. They stack up, one after another, until the state itself feels saturated with unresolved grief. And for each case that goes unsolved, the likelihood of the next one being solved feels just a little less certain. That's how cynicism grows, one unanswered question at a time. But cynicism is not the same as forgetting. People still remember Norma. Her name still appears in lists of cold cases. Her story is still referenced by those who insist that justice delayed is not justice denied, but justice waiting. Perhaps one day new technology will bring clarity. Perhaps one day someone will finally speak. Until then, her story lives as a cautionary tale about how easily answers can slip through the cracks. And as we move further back in time, her case is joined by another, just 1 year earlier, Myrtle Jackson, a name that may not be widely known today, but whose story adds yet another unresolved shadow to South Carolina's haunted ledger. Myrtle Jackson. The year before Norma Lanyon Jackson's case unsettled South Carolina, another unsolved mystery took root, this time tied to the life and death of Myrtle Jackson in 1977. Her name lingers today, not because the case was ever resolved, but because it wasn't. It has persisted, decade after decade, as a symbol of how fragile answers can be and how quickly a tragedy can dissolve into a riddle. Myrtle was not a stranger to her community. She was the sort of person people knew in the way small towns allow, not always by intimate detail, but by recognition, by presence, by the knowledge that she was part of the fabric of daily life. When her name suddenly appeared in connection with a violent end, the shock reverberated through her circle of family and neighbors. And when no culprit was ever found, that shock hardened into a kind of collective bewilderment that still lingers. What makes Myrtle's case so chilling is how little of it remains clear. The headlines at the time were brief, the official record thin. What details are available point only to the bare fact of her death and the open question of who was responsible. Unlike cases with clear suspects or strong leads that simply stall in court, Myrtle's murder seemed to resist explanation from the start. Investigators could not pin down a motive, nor could they trace a line of evidence that pointed to one person or group. It was as if the crime had been committed by a shadow present for a moment, then gone without leaving a trace. In communities where crime is rare, events like this do not fade quickly. They take on a second life in whispers and speculations, passed down through conversations in kitchens, in grocery store aisles, or at church gatherings. The theories about Myrtle's death were plentiful, but they never coalesced into consensus. Some believed it must have been personal, the result of some hidden grudge. Others thought it might have been random, a passing act of violence that collided tragically with her life. Still, others suggested there were secrets involved, secrets that Myrtle might have carried, or secrets others needed to protect. Each theory gave people a way to talk about the tragedy, but none gave them closure. The lack of resolution also weighed heavily on investigators. For law enforcement, unsolved cases are not just professional failures, they are personal burdens. Officers remember the faces of the families they spoke with, the statements they collected, the nights spent trying to connect dots that refused to connect. Myrtle's case was one of those burdens, and while time has carried many of those investigators into retirement, the file itself still exists one more manila folder in South Carolina's archive of cold cases. The human cost, however, cannot be filed away so neatly. For Myrtle's family, the decades of silence became their inheritance. Children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, all grew up knowing her name was tied to an unresolved mystery. The absence of answers shapes identity, especially in small families where stories are handed down carefully. Myrtle's story became less about who she was in life and more about the mystery that surrounded her death. That shift is perhaps the cruelest effect of unsolved cases. They turn people into puzzles rather than allowing them to be remembered fully as themselves. What makes her case all the more haunting is how it fits into the broader pattern of South Carolina in the 1972nd and 1982nd. These decades were marked by a wave of unsolved cases, murders, disappearances, unexplained deaths that still sit open today. Whether because of limited forensic tools, small-town resources, or simply the complexity of human behavior, too many of these stories have no ending. Myrtle's case is one among many, but that doesn't make it any less significant. In fact, it underscores the point. The state's history of mystery is not built on one or two sensational cases, but on dozens of smaller, quieter tragedies like hers. It also illustrates the way memory works. Unlike sensational cases that dominate headlines and then documentaries, Myrtle's story exists largely in fragments. She's remembered primarily by those closest to her and by the persistent line in public records, unsolved. Yet that very obscurity gives the case its weight. Myrtle represents the many victims whose names aren't widely known but whose mysteries remain just as troubling. Over time, some locals have suggested that new forensic techniques could eventually breathe life into her case. DNA testing, digital archives, genealogy databases, all the modern tools of investigation might one day bring a fresh perspective. And yet, as of now, those possibilities remain distant. Until that day, Myrtle's story remains a frozen frame in South Carolina's larger, unfinished film reel of mysteries. Her name, paired with the word unsolved, is a reminder that closure is not guaranteed, that justice can be delayed indefinitely, and that the absence of answers is itself a powerful presence. It lingers in memory, it shapes communities, and it leaves future generations wondering what really happened in 1977. And Myrtle is far from the only one. Just 2 years later, in 1979, another life was cut short. Lindbergh Johnson, whose unsolved murder deepened the sense that South Carolina's past is filled with shadows that refuse to lift, no matter how much time passes. Lindbergh Johnson. By 1979, South Carolina was already carrying the weight of a string of unresolved mysteries. From the haunting anonymity of the Sumter County Does to the lingering questions surrounding Norma and Myrtle Jackson, the state's unsolved ledger was beginning to look like a tapestry stitched together with silence. Into that tapestry, another thread was woven: the unsolved death of Lindbergh Johnson. His case, like so many others, has endured for decades without answers, leaving only questions in its place. Johnson's name does not stir instant recognition today. He was not the subject of national broadcasts, nor did his case inspire best-selling books. Instead, his story has existed mostly in local memory, sustained by the families who knew him and the investigators who tried unsuccessfully to close the case. Yet in many ways, that obscurity is part of what makes his story so haunting. It demonstrates that not every mystery becomes famous, but every mystery matters deeply to the people left behind. The circumstances of Johnson's death were unusual enough to demand attention, but not clear enough to provide resolution. His life ended in violence, but the who, how, and why have remained clouded ever since. The crime scene offered fewer clues than investigators expected. Neighbors reported little. No clear suspect was identified, and no motive surfaced that could withstand scrutiny. From the beginning, it was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. In small-town South Carolina, cases like Johnson's do not fade quietly. They leave a scar on the community. People remember where they were when they first heard the news. They trade theories in low tones at church potlucks and barbershops. Some are convinced they know the answer. Others shrug and admit the truth may never surface. Over time, the case shifts from a headline into folklore, another ghost story attached to a town's history. Lindbergh's name became one of those whispered references. You remember Johnson, don't you? Still unsolved. The personal toll was, of course, far heavier for his family. For them, his absence was not folklore, it was grief. The frustration of unanswered questions compounded the sorrow of loss. To bury someone is devastating enough. To bury someone without understanding the circumstances of their death is to live with a wound that refuses to close. For the Johnson family, anniversaries were not simply days of remembrance. They were reminders of the silence that had settled around his case. For investigators, Johnson's case was both typical and maddening. Typical in that it followed the familiar arc of many unsolved cases: initial urgency, followed by dwindling leads, followed by long-term stagnation. Maddening in that it never yielded even the glimmer of a breakthrough. Every promising lead seemed to collapse. Every potential suspect was ruled out. The file grew thicker with notes and thinner with possibilities. It became another folder in the cold case cabinet, where it still sits today, waiting for a future that may or may not deliver clarity. One of the most unsettling aspects of Johnson's story is the possibility that someone knows exactly what happened. In small towns, secrets are rarely contained forever. People talk, rumors spread, and eventually truth tends to seep out in fragments. But in this case, if anyone knew, they never spoke in a way that led to justice. The silence, whether born of fear, loyalty, or simple indifference, has lasted for decades. It raises the uncomfortable possibility that the answers exist but remain deliberately concealed. Johnson's story also highlights the limitations of forensic science at the time. In 1979, investigators lacked the tools that modern detectives now rely on. DNA analysis was still years away. Digital databases did not exist. Even basic record-keeping was less standardized. Evidence that might today yield a profile or a match was often overlooked or discarded simply because the technology to make sense of it hadn't been invented yet. That gap in time is one reason so many cases from the 1972nd remain unresolved, not because they are unsolvable in principle, but because they were mishandled before the right tools existed. And yet, despite all this, Lindbergh Johnson's case is not forgotten. His name still appears in official lists of South Carolina's unsolved homicides. Cold case advocates continue to raise awareness, hoping that renewed attention might stir memories or shake loose new leads. For his family, the hope is quieter now, tempered by the passing of years, but it has not been extinguished. They still want answers. They still want justice. They still want his story to be more than just another unsolved line in a forgotten ledger. Lindbergh Johnson's mystery is part of a grim chain. Each unsolved case becomes heavier when connected to the next, as though the state itself is burdened by a chorus of unresolved voices. And Johnson's case did not stand alone. The very next year, in 1980, another life was lost without resolution. Margaret Dash, whose death carried its own unanswered questions and added yet another name to South Carolina's growing list of mysteries that refuse to fade. Margaret Dash. By 1980, South Carolina's calendar of tragedies already felt too full. The Sumter County Does had baffled investigators. Myrtle Jackson and Lindbergh Johnson had left behind unresolved questions. And then, just as the new decade opened an era that promised new beginnings, new technologies, new optimism, another name was added to the state's long roll call of the unsolved: Margaret Dash. Her story does not sit in the center of true crime spotlight reels. Unlike the infamous cases that spawn books, podcasts, and endless television specials, Margaret's case exists mostly in the shadows mentioned in lists, remembered in whispers, marked in archives. And yet, her death remains one of the state's enduring mysteries, another thread in the frayed tapestry of unanswered questions stretching across decades. What little is publicly known about her case points to the most unsettling kind of story, one that feels as though it should be solvable, and yet it isn't. Margaret was not anonymous, not an unnamed traveler or faceless victim. She had roots, connections, a life woven into the fabric of her community. And yet, like so many before her, she became a name without justice. The facts are thin, the conclusions thinner. The details that do exist have been recited often enough to feel familiar, even though they never add up to resolution. She was killed. Her life ended under circumstances that never produced a clear suspect or a comprehensible motive. Investigators opened a file, canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed those who knew her. They followed leads, as investigators always do, trying to thread together the fragments of a story that no longer made sense. But at every turn, the leads dried up, the evidence refused to cooperate, and the silence thickened. The timing of her case made the failure sting even more. The 1982nd were supposed to mark an era of progress in policing and forensics. Fingerprinting had become more reliable. Forensic science was inching toward DNA technology, though not yet fully realized. Communities believed that justice was becoming more precise, more possible. But for Margaret Dash, those promises came too late. Her case never benefited from the advances that would emerge later in the decade and into the 1992nd. Instead, it remained trapped in the limitations of its time. For her family, the mystery was more than a legal problem, it was a personal torment. Families of unsolved victims live in a perpetual state of suspended grief. They bury their loved ones, but they do not bury the questions. Every holiday, every birthday, every quiet evening around the dinner table becomes a reminder of what they do not know. And because there are no answers, the imagination fills in the blanks with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. In Margaret's case, the whispers in her community carried as much weight as the official reports. Some believed her death must have been personal, a conflict with someone close to her. Others suspected something more random, an act of violence that came and went without logic. Still others leaned toward secrecy, suggesting that her death might have been tied to something she knew, something she saw, something she could not unknow. None of these theories ever rose above speculation. They remain theories, not facts. And speculation, no matter how compelling, cannot provide closure. What lingers most about Margaret's case is the ordinariness of her life before it became extraordinary in the worst possible way. She was not famous. She was not infamous. She was simply Margaret, a woman with routines, with people who loved her, with a story that should have unfolded quietly over decades of life. Instead, that story was cut short, and what remains is not a biography, but a mystery. The larger tragedy is how her name has been absorbed into a list. When people speak of South Carolina's unsolved cases, they often recite the roster: Dash, Johnson, Sanders, Holder, Rogers, Ryans. The individuality of each victim risks being flattened into a pattern, as though they are just markers of a phenomenon rather than people whose lives mattered. For Margaret's family, that flattening is unbearable. She was not just another statistic. She was someone. Her unresolved case also serves as a reminder of how time changes the landscape of justice. Each year that passes without resolution makes the truth harder to reach. Witnesses move away. Memories fade. Physical evidence degrades. Files are boxed and shuffled from one office to another, sometimes misplaced altogether. What was once urgent becomes archival. And yet, the weight of the case does not lessen with time. It simply shifts from the immediate shock of tragedy to the enduring ache of absence. Still, the possibility of answers is never entirely gone. Cold cases across the nation have been solved decades later through breakthroughs in DNA testing or the sudden decision of someone, somewhere, to tell what they know. It is possible, however faintly, that Margaret's case could one day be revived in that way. That possibility is enough for some families to continue hoping. Until that day, her story remains unfinished. A woman whose life was cut short, whose family was left with questions, and whose community was left with a shadow it could not explain. She belongs to the long, unsettling lineage of South Carolina mysteries that remind us how fragile the line between ordinary life and extraordinary tragedy really island. And she is not alone. Just 2 years later, in 1982, another name joined the unsolved roll call: Curtis Wayne Sanders, whose case only deepened the sense that South Carolina's past is filled with mysteries that resist explanation no matter how much time, effort, or technology is thrown at them. Curtis Wayne Sanders. In 1982, South Carolina added yet another unresolved tragedy to its already weighty list of unsolved homicides: the death of Curtis Wayne Sanders. His story is not one of national renown. It does not appear in the highlight reels of American crime television or in the best-selling true crime books that line airport shelves. Yet, for those who remember him, his name carries the same haunting power as any of the state's most famous mysteries. His case remains unsolved, suspended between memory and silence 4 decades later. By all accounts, Curtis was an ordinary man living an ordinary life. That phrase, ordinary life, is deceptive, of course. It suggests a kind of anonymity, when in truth, every life is extraordinary to the people who share it. Curtis was known to his family, to his friends, to his community. He was not faceless. And yet, in the aftermath of his death, he became something he never should have been: a question mark. The year 1982 South Carolina was no stranger to violence. The state, like much of the country, was grappling with economic changes, shifting cultural tides, and the fraying edges of small-town security. Yet, Curtis's death stood out, not because of its spectacle, but because of its lack of resolution. His story did not lead to handcuffs, trials, or confessions. Instead, it led to a file marked unsolved, one that has never been closed. From the outset, investigators faced obstacles. The crime scene offered little in the way of answers. Neighbors and witnesses could not provide the clarity they hoped for. As is often the case, the immediate aftermath was a scramble, piecing together timelines, tracking down leads, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. But the scramble quickly turned into a stall. The leads evaporated, the evidence refused to cohere, and the case began to sink into the slow, heavy rhythm of a cold case. For his family, the years that followed were marked by a grief complicated by confusion. Grief alone is unbearable enough. But grief without explanation, grief without resolution, is a different creature entirely. It lingers not only as sadness, but as frustration, as anger, as the gnawing sensation that something essential is missing. Families of unsolved victims often describe the same experience. They cannot fully grieve because part of them is still waiting, still hoping for the knock on the door that will finally bring answers. In the case of Curtis, those answers never came. Speculation filled the void. Some believed his death was the result of something personal, an argument that escalated beyond repair. Others thought it might have been random, a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Still others suggested the possibility of deeper secrets, the kind of hidden tensions that ripple beneath the surface of small communities and only emerge when tragedy forces them into view. But speculation, no matter how detailed, is not resolution. And resolution is what continues to elude the Sanders family. His story also underscores the limitations of law enforcement during that era. In the early 1982nd, the forensic tools we now take for granted simply did not exist. DNA testing was still years away from becoming a standard practice. Digital databases for fingerprints and criminal records were rudimentary at best. Even something as basic as communication between agencies was far more limited than it is now. What today might be solvable with a few keystrokes and a lab swab was, at the time, an investigative dead end. Curtis's case was a casualty of that technological gap. And yet, the case is not forgotten. His name remains on official lists of South Carolina's unsolved homicides. Advocates for cold case reform point to him and others as reminders of why these files matter, why they should not be left to gather dust in locked cabinets. Because each case is not just a file. It is a person, a family, a story cut short. It is a mystery that still matters, even decades later. What is most unsettling is the possibility that the answers do exist, but remain hidden in silence. Someone, somewhere, may know what happened to Curtis Wayne Sanders. In many unsolved cases, the truth lingers not in evidence, but in memory, in the conscience of someone who has carried a secret for too long. The question is whether that secret will ever be spoken aloud. For now, the silence endures. Curtis remains one more name in a litany of names, one more reminder of how fragile justice can be. His case reinforces a theme that runs through South Carolina's unresolved history, that the state's soil seems heavy with unanswered questions, each one rooted too deep to pull out cleanly. And just as his story began to fade into the 1982nd, another name was added to the list, Brenda Green, whose 1984 unsolved case carried its own weight of mystery and grief, further deepening the state's long shadow of unresolved tragedies. Brenda Green. By 1984, South Carolina's unsolved mysteries had already begun to take on the character of an unbroken chain each year, seeming to add another link, another name, another story without an ending. That year it was Brenda Green, whose death joined the ranks of the unresolved. Like many of the others before her, Brenda was not a celebrity or a notorious figure. She was a person with a life of her own, routines, people who cared for her, and plans for the future. And yet, in the decades since, her story has been remembered mostly for the fact that it is unfinished. When people look back at her case, what stands out most is how little has ever been revealed. Brenda's murder was investigated in the way that murders are always investigated, witnesses questioned, evidence gathered, possibilities weighed but no answers solidified. The file that began with urgency slowed into stillness. No arrests were made. No charges were filed. The family received no closure. All that remains is the knowledge that something terrible happened and that no one has ever been held accountable. That absence of accountability is, in many ways, its own cruelty, because without resolution, every detail becomes a haunting question. Was her death the result of someone close to her? Or was it the act of a stranger? Was it random? Or was it personal? Was it preventable? Or was it a collision of circumstances that could never have been foreseen? These questions weigh differently on each family member, but they weigh all the same. The timing of Brenda's case also carries symbolic weight. By the mid-1982nd, America was already talking about progress in forensics and policing. Crime dramas on television portrayed detectives cracking cases with near-perfect precision. Communities were beginning to trust that new tools and new technologies could prevent cases from slipping through the cracks. And yet, in South Carolina, here was Brenda Green. Her case unresolved, her family left with nothing but speculation, her name added to a growing list of mysteries that technology had not touched. Her family's grief, like that of so many others, did not diminish with time. In fact, it compounded. To lose a loved one is to live with absence. To lose a loved one without explanation is to live with absence and with uncertainty, a double weight that never really lifts. Families of the unsolved often describe it as a wound that will not close. Each year that passes is not simply another year of grief. It is another year of waiting, of hoping, of being disappointed when no answers arrive. And still, Brenda's name has not been forgotten. Though her case is rarely the subject of headlines, her name persists in official databases, in lists of cold cases, in the memory of advocates who push for renewed attention to unsolved crimes. That persistence is important, because the alternative, the true danger, is that people stop saying her name at all, that she becomes not just unsolved, but entirely erased. In the absence of resolution, communities often turn to folklore. Brenda's case is one of those that generates whispered speculation, passed down in conversations, carried like an heirloom of unease. Some insist that someone in the community must know more than they are saying. Others suspect that the case slipped away because of missed opportunities in the investigation. Still others wonder if there are secrets in her story that have never been spoken aloud. The lack of answers allows all these possibilities to coexist, which is both a coping mechanism and a curse. The truth about unsolved cases like Brenda's is that they don't fade, they accumulate. Each unsolved case does not replace the last, it sits beside it, adding weight to the whole. By the mid-1982nd, South Carolina was already carrying a heavy ledger of unresolved tragedies, and Brenda Green became part of that ledger. Her case illustrates how unresolved mysteries shape not just families but entire communities, altering their sense of safety, their trust in institutions, their relationship to justice itself. And yet, even after decades, there remains the possibility, however slim, that her case could still be solved. Advances in forensic science have revived countless cold cases across the country. DNA evidence once considered unusable has been re-examined with modern tools, producing answers long thought lost. Digital databases have allowed investigators to connect dots that once seemed unconnectable. For Brenda Green, the possibility remains that one day, her case could be among those revived. Until that day, however, her story remains suspended in time. She is remembered less for her life than for the mystery surrounding her death, and that is perhaps the greatest injustice of all. And as if to emphasize how relentless these mysteries are, South Carolina's list did not stop there. Just 17 years later, in 2001, another name would be added, Mia Livetta Millage, whose unsolved case would join Brenda's and so many others, proving that the state's trail of unanswered questions was far from over. Mia Livetta Millage. The year 2001 was meant to mark a new beginning, a new century, a new millennium, the promise of technology and progress smoothing out the rough edges of human life. And yet, in South Carolina, the new century opened in much the same way the old one had closed, with the arrival of another unresolved mystery. That year, Mia Lavetta Millage became another name on the state's growing list of unsolved cases. Her story, like so many before hers, is remembered not for its resolution but for its silence. Mia was young, with years ahead of her that should have been lived in full color. Instead, her life was cut short in a way that has never been explained, never clarified, never given the dignity of answers. For her family, that silence has lasted more than 2 decades. What little is known publicly about her death suggests the same frustrating pattern found in so many South Carolina cases. There was an initial burst of investigative activity, questions asked, evidence collected, possibilities explored, but then came the stall. The evidence did not align, leads dissipated, and soon enough, the case shifted into the limbo of unsolved, where it remains to this day. For her family, that label is not neutral, it is devastating. Unsolved means there is no justice, no closure, no way to fully move forward. It means living with an absence that is not only painful, but inexplicable. It means wondering, year after year, whether someone in the community knows the truth and is simply choosing not to share it. It means carrying grief that never settles, because it is tied to questions that never end. Communities carry that weight too. When cases like Mia's go unresolved, they don't just affect families, they affect entire neighborhoods. People wonder whether justice can be trusted, whether the system is capable of protecting them, whether silence means safety or danger. The lack of answers breeds suspicion, and suspicion reshapes the way people live together. In this sense, an unsolved case does not stay in the past. It ripples forward, altering the future in subtle but powerful ways. Mia's name continues to appear on official cold case lists, a reminder that her story is not forgotten. Advocates for justice keep her memory alive, insisting that unresolved cases deserve as much attention as any headline-grabbing trial. Her case underscores the reality that behind every unsolved entry in a database is a person, a family, a life that once had promise. Her story also reveals something sobering about the progression of South Carolina's unresolved mysteries. Even as the tools of investigation became more advanced, DNA testing, digital databases, surveillance technology, some cases still slipped away. Progress, it seems, does not guarantee resolution. And in 2001, despite all the optimism of a new century, Mia's case became one of those that slipped into silence. The questions surrounding her death remain unanswered. Was she targeted? Was it random? Was it a crime of passion, or of opportunity, or of secrecy? Each possibility remains open, each one haunting in its own way. Without evidence, without testimony, the imagination is left to fill in the blanks, and it rarely fills them kindly. For her family, hope persists, though tempered by years of disappointment. They know that cold cases have been solved decades later, revived by new forensic tools or by the sudden decision of someone to finally speak. They hold on to the possibility that one day, Mia's case will be among those revived. Until then, her name remains one more echo in South Carolina's long chorus of unresolved voices. And she is not alone. 10 years later, another disappearance would join the ranks of the unexplained, a case that began with the sudden absence of a young boy and has continued to haunt his family and community ever since. Amir Jennings. In 2011, South Carolina once again found itself staring into the abyss of the unexplained. This time it was the disappearance of Amir Jennings, a young child whose vanishing remains one of the state's most haunting modern mysteries. Unlike the older cases that live mostly in fading newspaper clippings, Amir's story unfolded in the full glare of the digital age, when social media could spread news in minutes and amplify speculation in hours. Yet even with all the technological reach of the modern era, Amir's disappearance has never been solved. The story began in Colombia, where Amir lived with his mother. Just before the holidays, his extended family realized something was wrong. Calls went unanswered. Visits led to locked doors. Soon enough, the absence was undeniable. Amir was gone. And from that moment on, his case became not only a search for a missing child, but a test of how a community, a state, and a nation would respond to a mystery unfolding in real time. The search for Amir was immediate and urgent. Law enforcement canvassed neighborhoods, conducted interviews, and issued public pleas for information. Volunteers joined the effort, distributing flyers, organizing searches, sharing his photo across social media. The hope was that someone, somewhere, had seen something that could bring him home. But as days turned into weeks, the hope grew harder to sustain. No credible sightings emerged. No trail could be followed. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. The unsettling reality of child disappearances is that they cut through the armor of everyday life. Adults can tell themselves that crime is random, that bad things happen to people who made bad choices, that the world is dangerous only if you step into danger. But when a child disappears, all of those illusions collapse. A child carries no grudges, no debts, no secrets that might warrant a disappearance. A child's absence feels like the universe breaking one of its own rules. For Amir's family, the disappearance became an unending cycle of grief and hope. Each holiday season since 2011 has been marked not only by his absence, but by the unanswered question of where he island. They have lived in the limbo that only families of the missing know, holding on to hope that he may still be alive while confronting the fear that he may not be. That contradiction becomes its own form of torment, one that never relents. The investigation has remained open, but open does not mean active in the way families wish it to be. Leads are followed as they arise, but no breakthrough has come. Every few years, a new flurry of media coverage brings Amir's name back into the headlines, reigniting hope that this time the story will finally resolve. And every time, the resolution fails to arrive. The disappearance of Amir Jennings also highlights something broader about South Carolina's history of mysteries. His case shows that even in an era of unprecedented connectivity, where cameras line streets, cell phones track movements, and data is collected on nearly everything, a child can still vanish without explanation. The modern world promised safety through surveillance, but Amir's absence reveals that mystery still finds a way. And so, Amir's name joins the chorus of unsolved stories. His photograph remains frozen in time, his future forever speculative. Will answers come? Perhaps. Families of the missing sometimes wait decades for closure. Until then, Amir's story is a reminder of how fragile safety is, how quickly it can fracture, and how long a mystery can linger in the lives of those left behind. And if his disappearance still feels incomprehensible, it is only one in a long line. Just 8 years earlier, in 2003, South Carolina was shaken by yet another murder that slipped into silence, the case of James Davis, whose unresolved death adds still more weight to the state's already crowded catalog of mysteries. James Davis. In 2003, in the eastern part of South Carolina, a man named James Davis was killed under circumstances that remain unresolved to this day. His case, like so many others scattered across the state, never found its conclusion. Instead, it has lingered in the background of local memory, a reminder that sometimes the simplest questions, who did this? Why? Can go unanswered for decades. James Davis was not a celebrity, nor the kind of person who attracted the attention of tabloids or national news. He was a man rooted in his community, with a kind of daily life that should have carried on without disruption. And yet, his death transformed him from a neighbor into a mystery, a name on the growing list of South Carolina's unsolved homicides. The details of his case have been kept brief in public record, as though even the telling of the story resists elaboration. What is known is that James's life ended violently, and that investigators were left without enough evidence to tie anyone to the crime. No arrests were made, no trial ever occurred. The story reached no resolution. The impact of that lack of closure rippled through his family first. For them, James was not an entry in a database. He was a father, a son, a brother, a friend. To lose him was painful. To lose him without answers was unbearable. Each day after his death became a day filled with questions. Families of unsolved victims often describe this as living in a fog, moving through life with a constant awareness that something is missing, something vital, something that should never have been taken. The community felt the loss too. Eastern South Carolina, like much of the state, is a place where people know one another, where lives intersect in ordinary ways. When a murder happens there, it is not an abstraction. It is immediate. It is personal. And when that murder is left unsolved, it unsettles the very foundation of communal trust. People begin to look at one another differently. They wonder if the killer was a stranger passing through, or if they were someone who smiled at them in the grocery store. The investigation into James Davis's death was methodical, but methodical does not always mean successful. Officers interviewed those who knew him, reconstructed his last days, and searched for evidence that could point them in the right direction. But each path forward collapsed into silence. As weeks turned to months, the momentum slowed. The trail grew cold, and eventually, James's case joined the long list of unresolved mysteries in South Carolina. For families like his, cold case is not just a legal phrase. It is a wound that never closes. It is an acknowledgement that the system has run out of answers, at least for now. But it is also a reminder that the file is not closed forever. Cold cases remain open, waiting for new technology, new testimony, new insight. And so, James's family has held onto that small flicker of hope that someday, somehow, the truth will emerge. His case also reflects something larger about the nature of unresolved mysteries. They are not just about what happened in the moment of violence. They are about the absence that follows. They are about the way grief stretches across years, reshaping families, altering communities, and reminding everyone that justice is not guaranteed. James Davis's story is not told often. It does not appear in documentaries or podcasts. It is not dissected in classrooms or debated in forums. But it remains important, because every unsolved case, no matter how quiet, matters. Every unanswered question is worth asking again. And every life, no matter how ordinary, deserves to be remembered as more than a mystery. And his story is not isolated. 17 years earlier, in 1986, another case had already entered South Carolina's unsolved ledger, a double murder involving Alex Pino and Juanito Floyd, whose deaths remain as confounding today as they were nearly 4 decades ago. Alex Pino and Juanito Floyd. In 1986, 2 men, Alex Pino and Juanito Floyd, were found dead in eastern South Carolina, their lives taken in what remains one of the state's most enduring double homicides. Their names are less widely known than some of the state's other mysteries, but in their communities, their story still resonates as an unsolved tragedy that refuses to fade. The fact that there were 2 victims immediately raises the stakes. A single homicide can sometimes be explained as the result of personal conflict or isolated misfortune. But 2 people killed together complicates the narrative. Were they both targets? Was one the intended victim and the other collateral? Was it random or was it deliberate? Each possibility leads to unsettling implications, and none of them has ever been confirmed. The case began with the discovery of their bodies, a moment that shocked their families and rattled their community. Investigators arrived quickly, gathering what evidence they could. But even in those first hours, the questions outnumbered the answers. Who could have done this? Why? And how had the killer or killers managed to leave so little behind? As with so many other South Carolina mysteries, the initial investigation produced leads that seemed promising but never materialized into resolution. People were interviewed, theories were floated, suspects were considered, but no one was ever charged, and the evidence never solidified. Over time, the case grew cold, settling into the frustrating limbo of unsolved. For the families of Alex and Juanito, the grief has been doubled. Not only did they lose someone they loved, they also lost the possibility of closure. Every anniversary, every family gathering, every moment of remembrance is accompanied by the same unanswered question. Why? Why them? Why then? And who was responsible? Without answers, grief remains raw, no matter how many years pass. The broader community has carried the weight as well. Double homicides are rare in small towns, and when they occur without resolution, they leave scars that do not heal. People live with the knowledge that 2 of their neighbors were killed and that no one has ever been held accountable. That knowledge erodes trust, fuels suspicion, and changes the way people see their world. Speculation has filled the silence, as it always does. Some believe the men may have been targeted because of something they knew or something they were involved in. Others think they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Still, others suspect that the case is tied to larger patterns of violence in the region, patterns that are rarely acknowledged publicly, but whispered about privately. Each theory offers a possible explanation, but none has been proven. What makes the case even more haunting is the passage of time. Nearly 4 decades later, the likelihood of new evidence surfacing feels slim. Witnesses age, memories fade, records degrade. And yet, there is always the possibility of a breakthrough. Advances in DNA testing, genealogical research, and digital forensics have solved cases once thought unsolvable. For Alex and Juanito, that possibility remains the thin thread of hope their families cling to. Their case, like so many others, reminds us of the fragility of justice. We like to believe that every crime has a solution, that every mystery can be unraveled with enough effort. But the truth is harsher. Some crimes resist explanation, not because they are unsolvable, but because the pieces we need have been lost to time. Alex Pino and Juanito Floyd's case is one of those. And yet, even as their story remains unfinished, it connects to the larger chain of South Carolina mysteries. Because just over a decade later, in 1999, another unsolved homicide would add its weight to the state's unresolved past, the case of Kent Williams, whose death underscores once again how often South Carolina's history has been punctuated not by answers, but by silence. Kent Williams. By 1999, South Carolina was already heavy with decades of unsolved tragedies, names stretching back into the 70s and beyond. That year added another, Kent Williams. His death, like so many others, came with questions that never found answers. His name has since been listed among the state's unsolved homicides, another thread in the long weave of mystery that runs through South Carolina's history. Kent Williams lived in a world that, on the surface, should have been unremarkable. He was not a celebrity, nor was he tied to the powerful families whose names circulate endlessly in headlines. His life was rooted in the ordinary friends, family, the rhythms of work and daily routine. And yet, his death placed him in the same category as some of the most haunting mysteries in the state, unsolved, unexplained, and unresolved. What investigators encountered in 1999 was a puzzle that resisted completion. The basic fact of his death was undeniable. But the questions, who was responsible, why it happened, and how it unfolded, never produced solid answers. The scene provided too few clues, and the testimony of those who might have known something was fragmented at best. For his family, the lack of answers was devastating. Grief is always painful, but grief without clarity is something different. It's like trying to carry a weight without being able to see what it island. It grinds at you, sharp in places you can't anticipate. For the Williams family, that weight has been constant. Each year since 1999, they've marked his absence with the knowledge that no one has ever been held accountable. The larger community absorbed the shock as well. In towns and neighborhoods across South Carolina, people learn to live with the idea that violence sometimes erupts. But when a killing goes unresolved, it unsettles the very concept of safety. People look at one another differently. They wonder if someone they know could be capable of such violence. They wonder if the person responsible is still walking among them, blending into the ordinary world. The case of Kent Williams is also notable because of its timing. The late 1992 were a transitional period for law enforcement. DNA testing was becoming more reliable. Databases were expanding. Communication between agencies was improving. Yet, even with those advancements, Kent's case did not resolve. It became another reminder that technology, while powerful, is not infallible. Justice requires more than tools. It requires evidence, witnesses, cooperation, and sometimes luck. And in this case, luck never arrived. Leads dried up. Suspects were considered and discarded. The file thickened but never yielded clarity. And over time, the urgency that drove the early investigation gave way to the slower rhythm of a cold case. Kent Williams became one more name in a cabinet of unresolved tragedies, his story waiting for the day when technology, or conscience, might finally break the silence. For those who loved him, that waiting has been its own torment. They have lived not only with his absence, but with the gnawing possibility that someone knows the truth and is simply choosing not to share it. That suspicion is its own cruelty, one that erodes trust and reshapes families in ways outsiders rarely see. Kent Williams's story remains unfinished, but it is not forgotten. His name still appears in public records, in lists of South Carolina's unsolved cases, in the memory of those who refuse to let the silence erase him. And his case underscores the central truth of all unsolved mysteries, that justice delayed is not only justice denied, but also justice demanded year after year until the truth finally surfaces. And Kent's story, though unresolved, was not the last. Just a few years later, in 2016, another South Carolinian Barry Shank would be added to the list of unsolved tragedies, deepening the sense that the state's history is lined not just with answers, but with shadows that refuse to lift. Barry Shank. The year 2016 feels close enough to touch. A world of smartphones, constant connectivity, social media headlines that spread in seconds. It feels modern, present, a time when mystery should have been harder to sustain. And yet, in South Carolina, that year added another name to the long list of the unsolved: Barry Shank. Barry's death was not just a personal tragedy for those who knew and loved him. It was also a reminder of how fragile justice remains, even in the 21st century. Despite all our technological tools, cameras on every corner, DNA kits in every lab, databases that span the globe, his case remains unresolved, a stark contradiction to the promise of progress. From the beginning, Barry's case was unusual not for its complexity, but for its resistance to clarity. The questions that should have been answered quickly, who, why, how, never crystallized into certainty. Investigators began their work as they always do, examining the scene, interviewing witnesses, tracing connections. And yet, every lead seemed to collapse under its own weight. For his family, the lack of resolution has been unbearable. They live not only with grief, but with uncertainty. Each day brings not only the pain of absence, but the frustration of silence. And in the years since, the silence has only deepened, leaving them to wonder whether the truth will ever emerge. The community, too, has been left unsettled. In a modern world where people believe everything leaves a trace, it is deeply disturbing when a crime produces none. It challenges the very idea of safety. It reminds people that even in an age of constant surveillance, mystery still thrives. Barry's case has been kept alive by advocates for cold case reform, who point to it as an example of why no file should ever be closed completely. The possibility of new evidence, new technology, or new testimony means that even cases from just a few years ago can one day be solved. His name remains on official lists, his story not forgotten, his case still technically open. Speculation has filled the gaps, as it always does. Some believe his death was the result of a personal conflict. Others suggest it may have been more random. Still others argue there may be secrets buried deeper, ones that have yet to surface. But speculation, however vivid, is not the same as truth. What is most striking about Bari's case is how it underscores the persistence of mystery. We live in an era where people expect answers immediately, whether through news updates, social media feeds, or forensic breakthroughs. But Bari's story shows that even in this world, there are still shadows that resist the light. For his family, hope remains fragile but present. They know that other cold cases have been solved decades later. They know that science continues to evolve. And they know that silence does not always last forever. But for now, they are left with unanswered questions, with grief that cannot be resolved, with a story that remains unfinished. Bari's death, like the many that came before, is a reminder that South Carolina's history is not only one of beauty, tradition, and resilience, but also one of mystery, silence, and unresolved loss. His name is one more echo in a long chorus of unanswered voices, and as the list continues, it shifts from recent years back to earlier decades, cases like those of Dale Dinwiddie and Jeremy James Grice, disappearances that stretch back into the late 20th century, each one adding its own weight to the state's catalog of mysteries that cannot be explained. Dale Dinwiddie. In the autumn of 1992, Columbia, South Carolina was buzzing with the kind of energy that comes when a city plays host to something larger than itself. That night it was a U2 concert, tens of thousands of fans filling Williams-Brice Stadium, the music booming so loud it seemed to rattle the air itself. Among the crowd was Dale Dinwiddie, a 3-year-old graduate student, artist, and daughter of a well-known family in the city. She went to the concert with friends, and for most of the evening, it was the kind of story that should have ended with ringing ears and the casual complaint about traffic on the way home. Instead, it ended with her disappearance, one of the most haunting mysteries South Carolina has ever known. After the show, Dale and her friends walked into 5 Points, Columbia's nightlife district. It was the kind of place where college students, young professionals, and music fans mingled well past midnight. Dale separated from the group, reportedly intending to head home. She was last seen outside a bar, asking for directions, and then nothing. She never arrived home, never called, never appeared again. To this day, no one knows what happened between the moment she was last seen and the moment her absence became undeniable. Her disappearance set off one of the most extensive searches South Carolina had ever seen. Police, volunteers, and even the FBI became involved. Her family, deeply rooted in the community, poured every resource they had into the search. Flyers were posted across the city, her photograph printed in newspapers, her story told on national broadcasts. If anyone had seen her, someone, somewhere, would surely come forward, but no one did. The unsettling part of Dale's case is how quickly a person can vanish even in plain sight. She was not lost in some remote wilderness, not swallowed by a storm at sea, not hidden in the chaos of a faraway city. She disappeared in the heart of Columbia, a place full of people, cars, and lights. The contradiction is stark. A young woman in the middle of a crowd simply evaporated. Theories abounded. Some believed she had been abducted by a stranger. Others thought she may have trusted the wrong person in the confusion of the night. Still others speculated about connections to unsolved crimes in other parts of the state. Yet none of these theories ever crystallized into evidence. Each one hovered like smoke, dissipating before it could be grasped. For her family, the disappearance was a living nightmare. Every day after 1992 was marked not only by her absence, but by the torment of not knowing. Families of the missing live with a cruel paradox. They must carry both hope and grief at once, never sure which one is more accurate. For decades now, the Dinwiddie family has carried that burden, marking anniversaries not with remembrance of a life completed, but with questions about a life interrupted. Even today, Dale's case remains open, her file technically active. Advances in technology have given investigators new tools, but so far, they have not produced the breakthrough that could end the silence. Her face still appears on missing persons databases, frozen forever at 23, while the world has aged 20 years beyond her. She remains an unsolved question in the middle of Columbia, a reminder that mystery can thrive even in the most ordinary of places. And her story did not stand alone. Just a few years earlier, in 1985, another South Carolina child, Jeremy James Grice, vanished under equally baffling circumstances, leaving behind a mystery that has haunted his family and community ever since. Jeremy James Grice. On a rainy morning in 1985, 10-year-old Jeremy James Grice disappeared from his family's home in Aiken, South Carolina. His mother went to wake him for school, only to find his bed empty. The back door was open. A trail of small footprints led away from the house into the wet grass and then stopped. Jeremy was gone. He has never been found. The details of that morning are burned into the memory of those who lived through it. The storm had left the ground damp and the air heavy. Jeremy's belongings were still in his room. There was no sign of struggle inside the house. And yet, the open door suggested something had drawn him outside. What that something was has never been determined. From the start, the search for Jeremy was massive. Police officers, firefighters, neighbors, and volunteers scoured the area. Dogs tracked his scent, helicopters circled overhead, search parties combed through woods and fields. The family's grief played out in front of television cameras as the community rallied, determined to find the missing boy. But as hours stretched into days and days into weeks, no trace of Jeremy was discovered. Theories about his disappearance have swirled ever since. Some believed he may have been lured away by someone he knew, someone who gained his trust before vanishing with him. Others speculated that he might have wandered off, though the sudden end of his footprints seems to argue against that. More unsettling theories suggested abduction by a stranger. Each possibility is plausible, and yet none has been proven. Jeremy's case underscores the fragility of safety, especially in childhood. Parents tell themselves that their homes are sanctuaries, that doors and locks are enough to protect their children. But his disappearance showed how thin that illusion can be. In a single morning, an ordinary home became the site of one of South Carolina's most haunting mysteries. For his family, the years since have been an unending ache. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone Jeremy should have reached has been marked not with celebration but with absence. His mother, in particular, became a tireless advocate, refusing to let his name be forgotten. She has lived with the torment of unanswered questions for nearly 4 decades, embodying the endurance and heartbreak of families of the missing. The community of Aiken still remembers Jeremy too. Even today, his case is recalled as one of the darkest chapters in the town's history. Older residents remember the search, the helicopters, the sense of fear that settled over the community. Younger residents, born long after, grow up hearing the story and realizing that even in a small town, mystery can strike without warning. His disappearance remains open, his case unsolved. Advances in technology have not yet revealed what happened, though they hold the possibility of future breakthroughs. But for now, Jeremy's name remains on missing person lists, frozen in time as a boy of 10, while the world has aged around him. And Jeremy's mystery is not alone. Around the same era, another child, Malakia Logan, would vanish under circumstances equally haunting, leaving behind yet another unresolved question in South Carolina's long and unsettling history of disappearances. Malakia Logan. The summer of 1988 should have been one of play and sunlight for Malakia Logan, a 4-year-old girl from Columbia, South Carolina. Instead, it became the year her name was etched into the long list of the state's unsolved disappearances. Malakia vanished on an ordinary day, leaving behind a mystery that continues to hang over her family, her neighborhood, and the city itself. Children are not supposed to vanish without explanation. That is the cruel paradox of Malakia's case. One moment she was there alive, present, known. The next, she was gone. Her family reported her missing quickly, sparking a search that consumed Columbia. Neighbors joined the effort, police canvassed the area, and her picture appeared on flyers across the city. Yet, despite the urgency of the search, she was never found. The circumstances of her disappearance remain murky, as if the details themselves refuse to align. Some reports suggested she may have wandered off, drawn by curiosity the way young children often are. Others speculated that she may have been taken, lured away by someone who knew her or by a stranger who saw an opportunity. Neither theory has ever been proven. What remains is the simple, devastating fact: she disappeared, and no one has been able to explain how or why. The investigation unfolded with all the intensity expected when a child goes missing. Law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts, search dogs scoured the area, helicopters circled overhead. Tips poured in, each one raising a flicker of hope before collapsing into disappointment. Over time, the search lost its urgency, as unsolved cases so often do. Leads dried up. Witnesses faded into memory, and Malachia's name joined the long list of missing children whose stories remain unresolved. For her family, the pain of that uncertainty has been immeasurable. Families of missing children live with a unique torment. They cannot mourn fully because they do not know for certain that their child is gone. But they cannot hope fully either, because the evidence suggests otherwise. They are trapped in an unending cycle of grief and hope, never free of the question, what if? For Malachia's family, that cycle has lasted decades. Columbia itself has carried the weight of her disappearance too. In neighborhoods where children once roamed freely, parents began to tighten boundaries. The disappearance of one child changes the behavior of an entire community. Fear creeps in, routines shift, and people learn to look over their shoulders more often. Malachia's absence became a reminder that safety, even in familiar places, is fragile. Her story remains unresolved, but it is not forgotten. Her name appears on missing persons databases, her case is still officially open, and her memory persists in the hearts of those who loved her. Each anniversary brings with it renewed attention, a reminder that the passage of time does not erase the mystery, and though decades have passed, the possibility of resolution remains. Cold cases have been solved after 40 years or more. Advances in DNA, digital archives, and public engagement could one day bring clarity to Malachia's case. Until then, she remains one of South Carolina's most haunting mysteries. And her disappearance is not the only one tied to that era. Just a few years later, in 1995, another South Carolina resident, Dana Satterfield, would vanish under circumstances just as puzzling, deepening the state's history of unresolved cases. Dana Satterfield. In the summer of 1995, Dana Satterfield was running her hair salon in Roebuck, South Carolina. She was a business owner, a mother, and a well-known figure in her community. On an ordinary day, she vanished from that salon, leaving behind one of the upstate's most perplexing mysteries. Dana's disappearance rattled the small town of Roebuck in a way few events ever had. She was not a stranger passing through, but a woman deeply rooted in the community. People knew her by name, greeted her on the street, and trusted her with the kind of everyday interactions that make up small-town life. For her to vanish suddenly and without explanation was unthinkable. Investigators moved quickly. They examined the salon, looked for signs of struggle, interviewed neighbors, and traced her last known activities. The scene itself suggested that something unusual had happened, but the evidence refused to form a clear picture. Rumors swirled almost immediately, as they always do in small towns. Some suggested she had been targeted by someone she knew. Others speculated it was random, the work of someone passing through. None of those theories solidified into fact. For her family, the disappearance was devastating. Dana was not just a community figure. She was a mother, a loved one, a person whose absence created an unfillable void. Every day after 1995 was marked not just by grief, but by unanswered questions. The inability to know what had happened, or why, was its own kind of torment. The community of Roebuck carried the weight too. People became wary, cautious, suspicious of even the most ordinary interactions. If someone as rooted and respected as Dana could vanish, what did that mean for everyone else? The case cast a long shadow over the town, altering its sense of safety for years to come. In the years since, Dana's case has remained unresolved. It has been revisited multiple times, occasionally resurfacing in news coverage or in discussions of South Carolina's cold cases. Each time, the hope is the same, that new technology, new witnesses, or new determination might finally bring clarity. Yet each time, the silence continues. Her disappearance highlights the cruel paradox of unresolved mysteries. They are not just about the moment of loss, they are about the years of silence that follow. They are about families who cannot move forward, communities that cannot let go, and questions that hang in the air long after the world has moved on. Dana Satterfield's case is a reminder that South Carolina's mysteries are not just historical, they are ongoing. They are not confined to dusty archives, but remain alive in the present, haunting those who remember and unsettling those who learn of them for the first time. And her case is not unique. Just as the 20th century drew to a close, the Lowcountry produced another mystery, this one dating back decades earlier, that still confounds those who study it: the strange death of Mary Ravenel in 1933. A case that remains one of Charleston's most enduring historical puzzles. Mary Ravenel. The year was 1933, and Charleston was a city caught in the contradictions of its own history. Grand antebellum homes standing alongside tenements, elegance brushing shoulders with poverty, and the steady hum of the Great Depression grinding down everyone's days. It was in this setting that Mary Ravenel's story unfolded and ended in a way that still raises eyebrows nearly a century later. Her death was, at first, assumed to be natural or accidental. But when the details emerged, the case shifted from sad inevitability to haunting mystery. Mary was a respected woman, well known in her Charleston circles. She was not the kind of person whose death should have been met with suspicion. And yet, when her body was examined, a detail came to light that transformed her story into one of the city's most enduring puzzles. She had a concealed bullet wound. This revelation cracked open the narrative and forced investigators to consider the unthinkable. The official handling of her case was, at best, contradictory. The coroner's report noted the suspicious injury, but no clear investigation followed. Some suggested the wound had been overlooked initially because those in charge of her case wanted to avoid scandal. Charleston, after all, was a city where reputation carried as much weight as fact. Others suspected that people in positions of influence may have intervened, ensuring that the truth was obscured or buried altogether. For her family, the discovery was shocking. What had first been explained as a natural or tragic death was now reimagined as a potential killing. But who would want Mary dead? The question has never been answered. Theories emerged, each more unsettling than the last. Some whispered of financial motives, others of family secrets, still others of affairs or grudges that had never made it into the polite record of Charleston society. The absence of answers left the community deeply unsettled. How could a woman of standing die with such suspicious circumstances and no resolution? What did that say about justice in Charleston? About the priorities of those in power? About how truth can be shaped or silenced by influence? Mary's case is rarely remembered in great detail now. It exists mostly as a historical curiosity, an odd entry in Charleston's archives, a story told occasionally by local historians who delight in the city's eccentric past. Yet beneath that surface is something darker, a reminder that mystery is not new, and that the tendency of truth to slip away is as old as the city itself. The 1933 case of Mary Ravenel suggests that some mysteries are not simply unsolved because of lack of evidence, but because of lack of will. Whether her death was deliberately covered up or simply neglected, the result is the same. Nearly a century later, we still don't know what really happened. Her story remains emblematic of the way Charleston's beauty often disguises its shadows. Behind the grand facades, there are secrets, some whispered, some written down, some buried altogether. Mary Ravenel's concealed wound is both literal and metaphorical, a sign that beneath appearances lies something far less comfortable. And as Charleston residents learned long after, mysteries in South Carolina are not confined to historical curiosities or genteel scandals. Some take on a life of their own, leaping from the shadows of folklore into the full blaze of popular imagination. Consider, for example, the creature that first emerged in Bishopville in 1988, a legend known only as the Lizard Man of Scape Ore Swamp. The Lizard Man of Scape Ore Swamp. In the sweltering summer of 1988, the town of Bishopville, South Carolina, became the unlikely epicenter of one of America's strangest modern legends. It began with a teenager, a car, and a swamp, and ended with a creature that locals swore walked on two legs, covered in scales, with glowing red eyes. The press called it the Lizard Man of Scape Ore Swamp, and the name stuck like mud on boots. The story began when a 17-year-old named Christopher Davis claimed he was driving home late at night after a flat tire forced him to stop near Scape Ore Swamp. As he finished replacing the tire, he reported seeing a 7-foot-tall reptilian figure charging at him. He jumped into his car, slammed the accelerator, and sped off, only to later find his car marked with deep, claw-like scratches. His account was detailed, terrified, and, to many, far too bizarre to be invented. The story hit local newspapers, and within days, Bishopville was transformed. Sightings poured in. Farmers claimed to have seen the creature stalking their property. Locals reported strange tracks in the mud, 3-toed, elongated, unlike anything in the region. Car hoods and fenders were suddenly presented as evidence, scratched and dented in ways their owners insisted were not man-made. The Lizard Man was everywhere, or at least, people said he was. Law enforcement treated the matter with wary skepticism, but did investigate some of the claims. They measured the mysterious footprints. They examined the damage to vehicles. They interviewed witnesses. What they found was inconclusive at best. The footprints, experts later suggested, might have been fakes. The scratches could have been caused by tools. And yet, the conviction in the voices of those who swore they saw something kept the legend alive. The media, of course, feasted on the story. Local television stations broadcast segments on the Lizard Man. National outlets picked up the tale, fascinated by the idea of a cryptid lurking in the Carolina swamps. Bishopville suddenly found itself on the map, its name linked forever to a creature no one could prove existed. For locals, the Lizard Man was both a source of fear and pride. Children told the story in hushed tones around campfires. Entrepreneurs sold T-shirts and postcards. Tourists came in search of the swamp monster, pumping money into a small town that had rarely attracted outside attention. The legend became part of the cultural fabric, a mixture of earnest belief and tongue-in-cheek amusement. Skeptics have since offered countless explanations. Some argue the creature was nothing more than a misidentified bear, its wet fur glistening under moonlight. Others suggest it was a prank that spun out of control, fueled by media frenzy and local enthusiasm. Still others propose it was mass hysteria, a kind of collective imagination sparked by the strange and unexplained. But believers remain. They point to the consistency of certain details across different reports, the sincerity of those who insist they saw the creature, and the fact that the swamp itself, with its thick vegetation and murky waters, is the perfect setting for something or someone to hide. The Lizard Man may or may not exist, but as a mystery, it doesn't need to. Its power lies in its endurance. Decades after the first sighting, Bishopville still celebrates its most famous resident. Festivals, roadside attractions, and folklore tours keep the story alive. Children grow up hearing it, and outsiders still come to hear locals tell the tale in voices equal parts serious and amused. What began as a single teenager's terrifying story has become a permanent piece of South Carolina's mythology. Whether real or imagined, the Lizard Man is as much a part of the state's identity as its history, its landscapes, and its unsolved cases. And the lizard man is not the only ghostly figure in South Carolina's lore. Along the coast, near Pawleys Island, another legend has endured for centuries. The spectral gray man, a figure said to appear before hurricanes, warning those who see him to flee before the storm arrives. The gray man, ghost of Pawleys Island. On the salt-stung edge of South Carolina's coastline lies Pawleys Island, a place where the Atlantic sighs against the shore and the marsh grasses sway in the wind. The island is known for its beauty, but also for its fragility. Hurricanes sweep through the Lowcountry with unnerving regularity, bending palmettos and tearing at foundations. Yet Pawleys Island has a legend that has made storms seem not only survivable, but strangely foretold. The story of the Gray Man, a ghost said to appear just before a hurricane makes landfall. The Gray Man is not your typical specter. He does not rattle chains or haunt abandoned houses. Instead, he walks quietly along the shoreline, his figure blurred, his face indistinct, dressed in gray from head to toe. Those who claim to have seen him insist that his presence is a warning, a spectral signal that danger is coming and that it is time to leave the island behind. The origins of the legend trace back to the early 19th century. The story goes that a young man, newly in love, was traveling on horseback to see his fiancée on Pawleys Island. Along the way, he was caught in quicksand in the marshes and died before reaching her. Grief-stricken, she later saw his ghost walking the beach, silent and gray. Soon after, a hurricane struck the island. Locals began to connect the two events, believing that the ghostly figure was trying to protect the living from the fate that had taken him. Since then, sightings have been reported before nearly every major storm to hit Pawleys Island. Families preparing to evacuate have claimed to see him on the dunes. Fishermen have reported spotting him from their boats. In 1989, just days before Hurricane Hugo devastated South Carolina, several island residents swore they saw the Gray Man strolling the beach, vanishing when approached. Their homes, they later noted, were among the few spared from destruction. Skeptics dismiss the legend as folklore, a comforting story born of fear. They argue that stress and imagination can conjure visions, especially when storms loom and nerves run high. Others suggest that shifting sands, shadows, and storm clouds create illusions that people interpret as a figure. But for believers, the consistency of the legend is hard to ignore. The Gray Man doesn't appear on ordinary days. He doesn't haunt the island without reason. He appears before storms, and only before storms, as though tethered to the weather itself. The power of the Gray Man lies not in whether he is real, but in what he represents. In a region where hurricanes are inevitable, his story offers a form of hope that there is warning, that there is guidance, that there is a force beyond human understanding watching over the coast. For islanders, the Gray Man is not a ghost to be feared, but one to be respected, even welcomed. The legend has become part of Pawleys Island's identity. Tourists hear it told in hushed voices during evening walks on the beach. Locals pass it down to children as both cautionary tale and reassurance. And each hurricane season, when the winds rise and the ocean grows restless, people look to the shoreline, half hoping and half dreading to see a solitary figure in gray. The Gray Man may be myth, or he may be something more, but his story endures, stitched into the very fabric of South Carolina folklore, standing beside the state's unsolved crimes as proof that mystery is not confined to violence. It also lives in the spaces between legend and belief. And belief becomes especially tangled when it collides with scandal, power, and modern crime. Nowhere is that more evident than in the saga of the Murdaugh family, whose story has become South Carolina's most infamous blend of tragedy, crime, and unanswered questions. Murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. On the 7th of June, 2021, the quiet of Moselle, a sprawling hunting property in Colleton County, was broken by a 911 call that would ricochet across South Carolina and eventually the nation. The caller was Alex Murdaugh, a powerful attorney from a family whose influence stretched across the Lowcountry for nearly a century. The victims were his wife, Maggie Murdaugh, and their two-year-old son, Paul. Their deaths set off one of the most notorious investigations in state history, a saga that has become both a courtroom drama and an enduring mystery. From the beginning, the case carried layers of contradiction. The Murdaughs were not an ordinary family. For generations, they had served as solicitors, essentially prosecutors for the 14th Judicial Circuit, building a dynasty of legal power. Their name was synonymous with influence, their connections reaching into law enforcement, politics, and business. And yet, here they were, a mother and son murdered on their own property. The crime shocking not only for its violence, but for the fact that it touched a family so long considered untouchable. Investigators immediately faced pressure from all directions. On one hand, the prominence of the family demanded answers. On the other, the family's web of connections made every step fraught with suspicion. Who could investigate the Murdaughs without being influenced by them? Who could be trusted to seek the truth without fear or favor? The initial theory spiraled outward. Some speculated that the killings were tied to Paul's legal troubles. 2 years earlier, Paul had been charged in connection with a fatal boat crash that killed one 9-year-old Mallory Beach. Lawsuits and public outrage swirled around the case, and Paul's name became the target of intense scrutiny. Could the murders have been retaliation? An act of revenge? Others pointed toward financial scandals. In the months following the murders, investigators uncovered evidence of Alex Murdaugh's alleged financial crimes, millions stolen from clients, years of deception hidden behind the facade of a successful attorney. Was the double murder somehow connected to these unraveling secrets? Or were the killings a desperate attempt to shift attention, to create sympathy, to obscure something larger? And then there were the broader questions. Was it possible that the Murdaugh dynasty itself had collapsed under the weight of its contradictions, its influence unable to shield it from chaos? Or was the story even darker, involving people outside the family who had reason to target them? Eventually, Alex Murdaugh himself was charged and later convicted in connection with the murders. Yet, even with a conviction, doubts linger. Some remain unconvinced of his guilt, arguing that the case against him leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. Others believe the conviction was justified, but still wonder if deeper truths remain hidden. Was Alex truly acting alone? Was there more to the story than what came out in court? The saga of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh's deaths is not just a crime story. It is a morality tale about power, influence, and the fragility of legacy. The family that once embodied authority in the Lowcountry became the subject of national fascination and disbelief. Their tragedy revealed cracks not only in their dynasty, but in the systems that had long protected them. And while the deaths of Maggie and Paul remain partly explained in the eyes of the law, they remain unresolved in the hearts of many. The unanswered questions still linger, especially when connected to the larger Murdaugh saga, including the boat crash that killed Mallory Beach, a case that intertwines with the murders and deepens the mystery of how far the family's shadow truly stretches. Boat crash killing of Mallory Beach. On the 24th of February, 2019, the quiet waters near Parris Island turned into the setting of one of South Carolina's most infamous tragedies. A group of friends, all in their late teens and early 20s, had gathered for what should have been an ordinary night out, laughter, camaraderie, and the reckless confidence of youth. Among them was Mallory Beach, a 9-year-old with her whole life ahead of her. By morning, she would be gone, her name forever linked not only to the tragedy of that night, but also to the sprawling, scandal-ridden saga of the Murdaugh family. The story began on a boat owned by the Murdaughs, captained by Paul Murdaugh, the youngest son of Alex Murdaugh. Friends later described Paul as having been drinking heavily, his behavior increasingly erratic as the night unfolded. Against the pleas of his friends, he insisted on driving the boat back through the dark, cold waters of Archer's Creek. Just before 2 a.m., the boat slammed into a bridge piling. The impact threw passengers into the water. Everyone surfaced except Mallory. Her body was not recovered until a week later, and in that span of days, the story became a media firestorm. The name Murdaugh was already powerful in the Lowcountry. Now, with Paul at the center of the tragedy, that name drew both scrutiny and suspicion. Critics accused law enforcement of dragging their feet, of bending rules, of protecting the family. Rumors spread that officers delayed testing Paul's blood alcohol levels, or that the scene itself had been mishandled. The Murdaugh influence, once a shield, now looked like a weapon. Paul was eventually charged with boating under the influence, resulting in death. But before his case could go to trial, he and his mother, Maggie, were murdered in 2021. The criminal charges against him died with him, leaving Mallory's family without legal closure. Civil lawsuits, however, continued, targeting Alex Murdaugh and others connected to the boat. These suits exposed the family's financial vulnerabilities, prying open the carefully guarded image of wealth and success to reveal decades of alleged fraud and theft. For Mallory's family, the tragedy has always been personal. She was more than a name in the headlines. She was a daughter, a friend, a bright presence whose absence is felt daily. Her parents have spoken of the pain of knowing her life was cut short not by random chance, but by recklessness and privilege colliding on the water that night. Their grief has been compounded by the endless court proceedings, the legal maneuvers, and the media frenzy that has kept her story in the public eye for years. For the broader public, Mallory's death became the first crack in the Murdaugh dynasty's facade. It exposed what many had whispered for decades, that the family's power was both vast and corrosive, enabling them to skirt accountability. When Paul was killed in 2021, speculation immediately returned to the boat crash. Some wondered if his death was connected, a form of revenge or silencing. Others believed it was part of a larger, more complex unraveling of the family's influence. The truth remains entangled in contradiction. On one hand, the boat crash was a clear tragedy of youthful recklessness. On the other, it became a symbol of institutional failure, of what happens when influence bends justice out of shape. And at the heart of it all is Mallory Beach, a young woman whose life ended in the water while others lived to tell the story. Her name continues to appear in lawsuits, documentaries, and articles about the Murdaugh saga. Yet behind the legal jargon and sensational headlines, her story is also about the fragility of life, about how quickly joy can turn to loss, and about how unresolved questions can ripple outward long after the night has passed. And unresolved questions are not confined to powerful dynasties. In Greenville, far from the Lowcountry drama, there are cases quieter, smaller, but just as haunting. Cases like that of Albert Adams, whose death remains an unsolved mystery in the city's own cold case files. Albert Adams. Greenville, South Carolina, is a city that prides itself on reinvention. Once defined by textile mills, it has transformed into a hub of culture, commerce, and growth. Yet beneath its polished exterior lies a collection of unresolved mysteries, quiet reminders that even thriving cities carry shadows. Among them is the unsolved homicide of Albert Adams, a man whose case has remained open for decades. Albert Adams was not a public figure, nor was he tied to scandals or headlines before his death. He was, like so many others on South Carolina's unsolved lists, a person living an ordinary life until violence made him extraordinary in the worst possible way. His death left investigators puzzled and his family grieving, and to this day, no one has been held accountable. Details about his case are scarce in public records, which, in itself, is telling. Some cases become legends, dissected in documentaries and debated in forums. Others, like Albert's thing, exist mostly in silence, preserved only in official files and the memories of those closest to him. That silence is both frustrating and haunting. It suggests that the answers may be out there but are buried too deep for anyone to uncover. Investigators who worked the case faced the same challenges common to many unsolved homicides: limited witnesses, unclear motives, and a crime scene that yielded too little evidence. Greenville in those years was not the bustling urban center it is today, and resources for investigating complex crimes were stretched thin. As with so many other cases, momentum slowed, leads dried up, and the file eventually migrated to the cold case shelves. For his family, the lack of answers has been unbearable. Grief without closure lingers. It doesn't fade, it calcifies. Families of the unsolved often describe living in two realities at once, one where life moves forward because it must, and another where time stands still, anchored to the moment of loss. For the Adams family, Albert's name remains an open question, a story without its final chapter. The city itself has changed dramatically since his death. New buildings rise where old ones once stood. Businesses flourish where mills once fell silent. But for those who remember Albert, the transformation cannot erase the absence. His case is a reminder that progress does not eliminate the past. It only builds on top of it, sometimes leaving old mysteries buried beneath. Cold case advocates argue that Albert Adams deserves the same attention as any other unresolved case, no matter how old, no matter how quiet. Advances in forensic science, DNA analysis, digital archives, genealogical databases have solved cases once thought unsolvable. His case could be among them. The potential is there, waiting for someone to revisit the file, to look again at the evidence, to see something others have missed. Until then, Albert Adams remains part of Greenville's shadow history. His name is not widely known, but it matters deeply to those who loved him, and to those who believe every unsolved case is a call for justice. And he is not alone. Just blocks away, in the same city, another unresolved case waits in silence. The death of Ralph Blassingame, another name on Greenville's list of cold cases, another story without its ending. Ralph Blassingame. Greenville, South Carolina, has always prided itself on being a city of contrasts, a place where historic red brick storefronts meet sleek modern towers, where Southern charm is marketed alongside urban ambition. But beneath that polished image lies a quieter reality, an archive of unresolved mysteries that refuse to fade with time. Among them is the case of Ralph Blassingame, whose unsolved death still lingers in the shadows of Greenville's history. Ralph's story is not widely publicized, and that may be what makes it so unsettling. His case exists primarily in the realm of official files, law enforcement lists, and the memory of those who knew him. Unlike some mysteries that draw the spotlight of national attention, his never did, and yet, to his family and community, his case matters just as much as any of the state's headline-grabbing tragedies. What little is known suggests a familiar, frustrating pattern. Ralph's death was sudden, violent, and unexplained. Investigators at the time pursued leads, interviewed witnesses, and tried to reconstruct the circumstances, but no definitive answers emerged. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more it slipped into silence. Eventually, Ralph's name was listed alongside others in Greenville's roster of cold cases marked as unresolved, yet never forgotten. The personal toll of his death is impossible to measure. For Ralph's family, the lack of answers has meant decades of grief mixed with uncertainty. They know what they lost, but they do not know why. They have had to navigate birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays without him, carrying both absence and confusion. Grief with explanation is hard enough. Grief without explanation is unbearable. The community, too, felt the impact. Greenville is not a city where violence is anonymous. People know their neighbors, their coworkers, their congregations. When someone like Ralph dies and no one is held accountable, suspicion creeps into everyday interactions. People wonder whether the killer was a stranger who disappeared into the night, or someone who still walks the same streets. That uncertainty changes the way communities function. The case also reflects the challenges law enforcement faced at the time. Investigative resources were limited. Forensics, though evolving, were nowhere near today's standards. The idea of DNA as a routine investigative tool was still years away. Evidence that might today be considered vital may not have been preserved then, leaving gaps in the record that cannot be filled retroactively. Yet Ralph's case remains officially open, as all cold cases technically do. It sits in the archive, waiting for either a technological breakthrough or a confession that might finally bring resolution. Advances in forensic genealogy have cracked cases once deemed impossible. Could his case one day be among them? It is possible. The story of cold cases in America is filled with examples of sudden breakthroughs decades later. Until then, Ralph's story remains unfinished. His name is etched into Greenville's list of unsolved tragedies, a reminder that beneath the city's glossy present are wounds that have never healed. His family waits, his community remembers, and his case lingers as one more example of how justice delayed can feel indistinguishable from justice denied. And Ralph's story is not isolated. Just as his case settled into silence, Greenville recorded yet another unsolved homicide, this time a double case involving Ernest Chick Bolden and Oscar Rice, two men whose unresolved deaths further deepened the city's shadow archive. Ernest Chick Bolden and Oscar Rice. If one unsolved murder can fracture a community's sense of safety, a double homicide shatters it outright. That was the case in Greenville when Ernest Chick Bolden and Oscar Rice were killed, their deaths leaving behind questions that have never been answered. Decades later, their names remain linked in the city's cold case files, a chilling reminder of how two lives can be erased in one act and yet never explained. Bolden and Rice were known in their circles, not anonymous figures passing through town. They had roots, routines, and connections. That is what makes their case so disturbing. These were not faceless victims. They were community members, people others knew by name. When their lives were taken, it was not just a private loss, but a public shock. The investigation began with urgency, as double homicides always do. Detectives worked the scene, gathered evidence, and questioned anyone who might have had information. But almost immediately, the case became complicated. Were the two men targeted together, or was one the intended victim and the other simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? That distinction, seemingly simple, has haunted the case ever since. Theories sprang up quickly. Some suspected personal motives, grudges, debts, arguments that had escalated beyond repair. Others suggested something more random, perhaps a chance encounter gone wrong. Still others whispered about larger patterns of violence, connections to crime that stretched beyond Greenville. But none of those theories ever solidified into fact. For the families, the impact was doubled. Two households left with the same absence, the same confusion, the same unending grief. To lose one loved one is devastating. To lose two in the same moment, without answers, is almost unimaginable. For years, they have carried the same questions. Why these two men, and why together? The fact that those questions remain unanswered compounds the loss. The community felt the shockwaves as well. Greenville, like many southern cities, thrives on the idea of connection, that people know one another, that safety is found in familiarity. But the Bolden and Rice case disrupted that narrative. If two men could be killed without explanation, then perhaps no one was as safe as they imagined. The case remains unresolved, but not forgotten. Their names are still listed in Greenville's official archives, still remembered by family, still cited by cold case advocates as examples of why no mystery should be abandoned. Advances in forensic technology could one day offer answers, though the trail grows colder with each passing year. The possibility remains, slim but real, that new evidence could emerge, or that someone, somewhere, might finally speak. Until then, Bolden and Rice remain part of Greenville's unsolved ledger, their story another thread in the larger fabric of South Carolina's unresolved history. And their case, tragic as it is, did not close the chapter. Greenville's list of cold cases would continue to grow, with names like Alfonso Ace Brown, whose unresolved death added yet another layer of silence to the city's already weighty archive. Alfonso Ace Brown. Greenville, South Carolina, is the kind of city that tries hard to present itself as polished, new, and thriving. But beneath its modern downtown and bustling neighborhoods lies a file cabinet filled with cases that remind the city of its unresolved past. Among those names is Alfonso Ace Brown, whose unsolved death remains a wound that is never closed. Ace, as he was known, was not a shadowy figure without ties. He was part of Greenville's fabric, a man people recognized and remembered. His life was rooted in the ordinary work, family, routine. That is what makes his case all the more haunting. His story was not supposed to end in mystery, and yet it has. The circumstances of his death remain unclear. What investigators found was not enough to draw a straight line between evidence and resolution. The file contains the basics: a life lost, a crime committed, but no clear suspect, no undeniable motive. The lack of clarity turned the case into another frustrating entry in Greenville's growing list of cold cases. For his family, that absence of answers has meant decades of unrelenting grief. They live with the same daily burden carried by so many families of the unsolved. Birthdays pass, anniversaries slip by, holidays arrive and depart, all with the unspoken reminder that their loved one's story remains unfinished. They cannot turn the page because they have never been given the final chapter. The community, too, absorbed the shock. In Greenville, where neighborhoods are tightly knit, an unsolved homicide reverberates. People become wary, suspicious. They wonder whether the person responsible might still be walking freely among them. They wonder whether the truth was overlooked, or worse, deliberately ignored. That uncertainty reshapes communities in ways outsiders rarely notice, but insiders never forget. The case also highlights the limitations of the time. Forensic science was evolving, but the tools available then were not the ones investigators have today. DNA analysis was not yet as precise, databases were limited, and communication between agencies was slower. Evidence that might have cracked the case wide open in 2023 simply didn't exist as a possibility when Ace died. That gap in resources left his case vulnerable to becoming unsolved, and so it did. Yet his case is not forgotten. His name appears on Greenville's cold case list, a reminder that justice is not only about the present, but also about the past. Cold case advocates point to Ace's story as proof of why no file should ever be closed entirely. The potential for resolution still exists. Advances in forensic genealogy, digital archives, and even artificial intelligence applied to evidence have revived cases once deemed impossible. There is always a chance that Ace's case could be one of them. Until then, his story remains unfinished, suspended between memory and silence. His name is a reminder of the fragility of life and the persistence of mystery, and he is not alone. Greenville's archive holds yet another case, one that has lingered for decades. The story of Terry Dale Fettner, whose unresolved death continues to haunt the city. Terry Dale Fettner. The final name on Greenville's cold case list is Terry Dale Fettner, and his story encapsulates everything unsettling about unsolved mysteries. Dale was a man known to his family and community, someone who should have lived an ordinary life. Instead, his death became another puzzle that investigators could not solve, another story that ended in silence. The details of his case, like so many others, are scarce in public record. What is known is that his life ended violently, and that no one has ever been held accountable. The crime scene yielded too few clues. Witnesses, if there were any, offered too little. And as the days turned to weeks, the weeks to months, the months to years, Dale's case slipped into the category of cold. For his family, that word cold is unbearable. It suggests finality without resolution, acknowledgement without closure. It means they are left not only with grief, but also with unending questions. They know what they lost, but they do not know why. They know who is gone, but they do not know who is responsible. That lack of answers has shadowed them for decades, shaping their lives in ways few outsiders can understand. The community, too, carries the weight of Dale's case. In Greenville, unsolved homicides are not just private matters. They become part of the city's collective memory, whispered about in neighborhoods, remembered in church pews, mentioned quietly at gatherings. people recall where they were when they first heard the news. They remember the theories, the rumors, the suspicions, and they live with the reality that justice has never arrived. For investigators, Dale's case is another burden in a long list. Detectives worked the scene, followed leads, and tried to piece together the puzzle, but the pieces never aligned. Over time, the urgency faded, replaced by the slower rhythm of cold case work. The file grew thicker, but the answers never came. And yet, the case remains open, waiting for the day when new evidence, new technology, or new testimony might finally break the silence. Dale's case, like so many others, also reflects the broader truth of South Carolina's history of unsolved mysteries. These cases are not just about crime, they are about silence. They are about the gaps between what we know and what we cannot explain. They are about the weight of absence, carried by families, communities, and even entire cities. And though Dale's case marks the final entry on Greenville's official cold case list, it does not mark the end of South Carolina's unresolved history. From the Sumter County Does to the Lizard Man, from the death of Mary Ravenel to the disappearance of Amir Jennings, the state is saturated with mysteries that remain stubbornly unexplained. Together, these stories form a kind of shadow narrative for South Carolina, a reminder that beneath the state's beauty, beneath its traditions and its progress, lies a ledger filled with unanswered questions. The names on that list are more than just entries. They are lives, each one carrying a story that remains unfinished. And as long as those questions remain, so too will the mysteries, lingering in silence, waiting for answers that may never come. Because in South Carolina, the unresolved is not the exception, it is the rule. And that rule leaves us with the unsettling truth. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to be remembered, haunting us precisely because they cannot be explained.